Hello everyone and welcome back to class number 11 on flight planning. So for today's class, this is where we're going to need those materials that we talked about on the first day. Just as a reminder, this is the time you'd want to have your E6B, which is this little device here. It has two different sides, basically has what we call a windward side and this little thing that spins. And then on the flip side of that, we have the flight computer portion. We're going to talk about how to use this today. And we're also going to need this sucker. You do not need to have the rotating plotter. Some of them are fixed, meaning that they don't actually rotate, but we're also going to need this as well. Now, we will be teaching out of the Los Angeles sectional. For the purposes of today, you do not need to have Los Angeles sectional. You can follow along using SkyVector or any of the other map products that are available online. The reason why we want you guys to actually have maps doesn't really matter where they're from. They could be from a different part of the country or an area, is just kind of practice. What you're going to realize today is that to teach flight planning from start to finish, if I were to do it one-on-one with the student, it would typically take almost 4 hours. And that's just the first try. And you can imagine that as we're basically going through this, your weather is going to be outdated. Now all this stuff is basically going to come and go in terms of your performance information, and your numbers are definitely going to change by the time you actually get out to the airplane and take off. So you're not going to be an expert, but you will understand exactly how to do it from start to finish. And I would recommend maybe watching this video a few times to kind of see what the process is, where we actually collect the data and the information from, and then follow along with the calculations as well. The other thing I'll also mention is that after this class, I would encourage you to go out and plan your own flights, plan these fictional flights, pull the weather as we're going to show you how to do, and practice. Honestly, by doing this enough times, if you can do this 5 or 10 times, I can plan a flight manually, probably within about 15 or 20 minutes and do all the calculations. But that's because of just a lot of practice and working with the materials and knowing where to go to get this information is kind of half the battle as well. Reality is that once you are graduated from a private pilot, you're most likely not going to be doing these things by hand in the future. You're probably going to be using an electronic flight bag or some type of electronic product that allows you to do flight planning pretty much instantaneously. But leading up to your private pilot license, the examiners still want to make sure that you understand what the calculations are doing. All this automation is actually doing in the background when they're calculating all of these different things that we're going to show you how to calculate moving forward for today. As a reminder, we do have moderators in the platform, so just keep that in mind. If you have any questions about the course or any of the content that we're covering, perfect time to ask it. In addition to that, there's really no questions. I think there's maybe one FAA test question. Just remember to use the vote button when that shows up. Other than that, the other thing I'll also mention is that the weather and information that we use in this class is from a previous lesson. So when you're following along, the weather that we grabbed and the weather that we are actually showing you in this video is from, I believe, May of last year. May of last year. And just keep in mind that whatever weather, if you were to put in the exact same criteria, the weather is obviously not going to be the exact same values of what we pulled on that day. So the reason why we stick with this older weather packet is it's too difficult to change the PowerPoint the day of and do this in real time. It does take a lot of effort and energy to do so, and we just wouldn't get it done in time. So what we're going to do is we're going to take you through the process of actually pulling weather. Just realize that the weather that you grabbed today is probably going to be different than what we had about a year ago. And in addition to that, I will give you standard fixed values that we're going to use across the board. We'll explain that as we basically move forward. So this is the second to last class. We are almost at the home stretch here. We're going to be working on flight planning, but before we do so, remember that we did not finish our aircraft performance. So we left off with weight and balance. So we're going to finish that up first. Then what we're going to do is we'll switch gears and we're going to spend the majority of our time working on our flight planning exercise. So we're going to look at all of the steps from A to Z in terms of pulling the weather, planning the route, which altitude you should select based upon regulations and the weather information at hand, looking at the performance information, calculating performance, and at the end of the day, we're going to try to bring together everything that we've learned so far into a single lesson. The reason why this is important is as you start working on your solo cross countries, you're going to be expected to do and calculate these flight plans for every cross country that you do by yourself. In addition to that, as you're getting ready for your check ride, your designated pilot examiner or the FAA representative who will be your effectively your examiner will request that you plan some type of flight. If you're lucky and you've got a really, really cool or nice DPE, sometimes they'll let you plan it a couple days ahead of time. Other times, some want the information planned on the exact same day of travel, which makes it a little bit more challenging as well. So in addition to that, we're going to be looking at all the different navigation types, but this is where we're specifically going to be focusing in on dead reckoning, which is time, fuel, and distance calculations. We'll talk about how to use that E6B. We'll also look at radio and electronic navigation, route selections, planning, altitude selections. We're going to spend 30 minutes on weather for flight planning. We'll look at the different components that we'd want to kind of interest ourselves in with the chart supplement, meaning what are the important factors flying in and out of an airport and everything else in between. So at the end of the day, like I said, you'll have all the steps that you need to, but you're not going to be able to memorize all of them. So this will take some trial and error and definitely some practice moving forward. In addition to that, with the E6B, you're not going to be an expert with the E6B either, but beneath the live stream, Travis has included our E6B video, which is about an hour. And what I do is I take you through 15 different problems that you could follow along in. And there's actually a PDF handout that you can do as well. So I basically give you a problem just like we do in class, 60 seconds or 90 seconds to complete it. And then I show you on camera exactly how to solve that, which way to spin the device, and what numbers we're actually looking for. So by the time you're done with that, if you can do 5 of each problem set, meaning that there's typically 5 fuel calculations, 5 distance calculations or wind corrections, and ground speed, you'll be fairly proficient moving forward with using that E6B. So that's something else that I'll remind you at towards basically the tail end of class. As a reminder, you should have received an email invite from us to leave either a Facebook or Google review or whatever your preferred platform is. It's not really for us, but it's to let future students know about the course and what tidbits you can provide to them in terms of how to be successful in the program. As a quick reminder, next week, basically a week from today, you'll receive a confidential course survey. And they are completely confidential. We just want to know what went right, what went wrong, what you guys like, what you didn't like. And we do go through those with a fine-tooth comb. Pretty much 80 to 90% of our changes here in-house are actually from your comments. And a lot of that has really shaped what we do. Everything from the mobile app on multiple platforms, being able to stream the live classes, changing up the test questions, and a bunch of other things. So including one of the big requests that we've had over the last 2 years is more classes. So we used to only do 1 class per month, and now we've expanded that to 6 classes per month for better timing for everyone. So it only takes a few minutes, and we encourage you to fill out both if you can. And you'll probably see another reminder here in your inbox over the weekend as well. Okay. All right, and then finally, we should all know by now there is no catch to the class. You guys have access to the live streams, the team of moderators, the IT team, the recordings on multiple platforms. You also have access to the documents, the quizzes, the handouts, and everything else in between, including the endorsement and the final exam at the very end of the day. We don't charge for any of that stuff, so there really is no catch. The only thing that we do, like I've always said, is if you want to call it a catch, is we will close out the class at the end of the course. Give you a couple extra days to wrap up any last-minute lessons that you may need to watch, and also take the final exam. So there's really no rush there as well. Remember that your last day of class, for those that started on a Sunday, you get a bonus day. For those that started on a Monday, you have 5 days in addition to the last day of class before we close it out. In order to get your FAA written test endorsement, all you need to do is watch all 12 of the lessons. It does not matter whether it's recorded or if it was live. You can mix and match there. And then on the last day of class is when the final exam does become available to you. With that final exam, it is a total of 60 questions, 2.5 hours. You just need to get an 80% or higher to pass. And once you meet that criteria, the endorsement will basically be issued instantaneously to your account. Even if you are scoring at an 80%, I still encourage people to continue to take the practice test, and it'll expose you to more questions. And the reality is it's going to make you better prepared when you take the official FAA exam at one of the testing centers. So once again, for those that started on Sunday, you'll have a bonus day. So you'll have 6 days before we close the class. If you started with us on a Monday, you're going to only have 5 days, but that's the standard time. So on Wednesday, 16th, regardless of when you started, that's the date that we're going to close out class at 12 noon Pacific time. And the reason why we do that is it gives us that higher completion rate. We're currently sitting at about 95%, as I've stated before. Hopefully we can always try to improve that number. But everybody who started with us on day one, we want to kind of hold your feet to the fire and get as many people through at the end of the class. Now, we understand that life gets in the way and everything else. And that's the reason why we do have the lifetime membership that we have been offering since day one as well. Now, we do understand that life gets in the way. There's always things that, with our best intentions of finishing things, careers, work, family, stress, all sorts of things always, kind of hamper our goals or kind of our timelines that we had in our head. Remember that we do also have access to the Private Pilot Lifetime Membership, which does give you access, obviously, to the Private Pilot Ground School. And it does give you both the live classes, so any of the future live classes, including the ones that we do just for our members, and also the pre-recorded classes that we do professionally in the studio. We basically break down the classes. There's no breaks or anything like that. We can actually cover a little bit more material as well, just because we're not limited by time here. And those are usually between 60 to 70 mini lessons. As I've kind of been alluding to, probably I think it was last week when we were talking about this, we are pushing out about 30% more content for the private pilot, and that's moving forward. That's actually starting to be introduced as we speak. So it's kind of exciting to see the evolution as things progress here. In addition to the Private Pilot Ground School, you'll also have access to the Private Pilot Oral Prep course, which is designed to really prepare you for your check ride. It really highlights all the material that is pertinent and that you're required to know before you actually see or whatever your examiner is, whether it's a DP or an FAA official. You'll also have access to the Private Pilot Flight Maneuvers. So there's about 30 plus maneuvers in there that you need to know when you're actually starting your flight training. You also have access to the PDF companion guide, which is about 900 pages of color material, about 120 pages of course notes, basically everything you need and more. You also have access to the 900 plus FAA-like test questions, which means that you get unlimited practice quizzes and exams. For most of you, if you realize that if you take the quizzes multiple times, you're not going to get the same questions. They will be jumbled and they could be completely different questions. So the reason why we've always encouraged you to take the quizzes multiple times as well. You have 24/7 support from our team of instructors here, and also the written test endorsement and the FAA Wings credits moving forward. So that's it for my public service announcement there. Remember that you can also participate on the mobile app as well. So with that mobile app, you can find it in the corresponding store, either the Google Play Store or the Apple Store. Search under Check Ride Prep or Check Ride Space Prep, and within there you can actually view all of our courses, including this one. You can download the videos after they are available. Keep in mind the only limitation is you can't watch the live streams on here. But you'll be able to basically download the videos, watch them offline should you not have an internet connection. It also has access to basically the same things, all your course materials, the videos, the handouts, the quizzes, the tests. You also have the same functions in there, the help desk, ask a CFI. You can message us in there. You can find all the documents in there as well, and all of that fun stuff moving forward. So feel free to check that out. If you're unsure of where to find that, like I said, you can either search for it in those corresponding stores, or when you log into the portal, if you go to the very, very bottom of the portal, there's direct links to either one, depending on what platform you are specifically looking at. That's really it with my public service announcements. Let's go ahead and get going with. All right, so moving back to aircraft performance, there's really only two things that we need to cover. So there's basically our crosswind component. And with a crosswind component, there's usually going to be a chart that looks something like this. Cessnas have this chart, Pipers do not, but no matter what, the chart is universal. Does not matter what airplane you fly. And traditionally, if you were to look in a Cessna anyways, it will say a max demonstrated crosswind. Because it's a max demonstrated crosswind, it's usually like 15 or 16 knots. That is not a limitation. That's just that was the maximum they actually demonstrated for testing purposes. Usually you can take a Cessna, like one of the newer Cessnas, the 172. I think the best I've done is maybe a 30, 31 or 32 knot crosswind. Basically, when you've got no more rudder authority to hold the center line, then you can't do anything with it. That's going to exceed the actual aircraft limitations as well. So very simply, what you need to know is what runway you're taking off from. So in this example, we've got runway 30, which is 300 degrees. And we have the wind out of 330 at 40. So what we're going to be doing is we're basically just measuring the angle here, and we're basically figuring out it is 30 degrees off from the runway center line, or basically which way the aircraft is going. Okay. So where we start with is you have the degree markers here. So 0, 10, 20. In this case, we're going with 30 because it's 30 degrees off from 300, which is the runway heading. Then what you've got is you're going to have these different sets of lines. And you can see here, this is basically 60, 50, 40, 30. And you can basically look kind of on the edges here to see what that actual arc is supposed to represent there. And the main thing is it's telling us that it is at 40 knots. So you're basically going to follow that 30-degree line down until you get to the 40 knots. And then you're going to be able to basically draw a line straight down from that point, which is here. And in this case, what that's telling us is this horizontal axis is the crosswind component. So we've got a crosswind of 20 knots, basically off the right-hand side. And then the other line that we can draw is basically another horizontal line here. You can see it's right between 30 and 40, and this, our vertical axis, is our headwind component. So in this case, we have 35 knots of headwind, and we have a 20 knot crosswind component when we look at it, okay? So another example where you guys get your test questions here. We have an airplane on runway 18. So remember, magnetically, that is 180. We have wind that's reported of 220. So all you have to do is basically subtract 220 from 180, and that's going to give us 40 degrees, okay? And then we know that they're telling us that it's supposed to be at 35. So because it's 40 degrees, I'm going to start off right here where it says 40, and I'm going to follow this line down until I get to 35. Now this arc right here, that is 40, and this arc right here is 30. Okay, so it's going to be somewhere between there. In this case, the author does a good job pointing that out for us right there. And then all you got to do is draw a line straight down and then draw a line straight across. Now keep in mind, the test question usually will ask you for either a headwind or a crosswind. So be careful with which you're reporting in terms of the A, B, or C. If I asked you, what is the crosswind in this case is 23 knots, okay? Because that is on our horizontal axis. If I asked you in the test question, what is the headwind component? Very simply, you're going to draw the line straight across there. And I would say, maybe it says 27, but I would say 27, 28 on your headwind component, okay? So read the question, figure out what it's asking for. Remember, the headwind component is your vertical axis. The crosswind component is your horizontal axis, okay? All right, so let's test this out. I've got 2 FAA test questions that revolve around this. Let me go ahead and open up the poll here. Sure, I've got the right one here. All right, so what is the maximum wind velocity for a 30-degree crosswind if the maximum crosswind component for the airplane is 12 knots? This is figure 36 in the event that anybody wants to look it up in the testing supplement. You can ignore that red line. That red line is not there for the answer, just like what we talked about with loading problems or anything else. That is just there as a guide, as an example. Got the first couple answers coming on in. Right, got about a third of the class in. For anybody that's waiting, just remember, print out the PDF. You can find it under this lesson. If it isn't, just let me know. It may have gotten deleted. Just let me know and we'll give you a link for it. But it is the VFR navigation log that you guys will need for the next step. And then we also put together an E6B guide as well. It's like, I think it's 12 different pages. So it will take you through step by step how to use an E6B with all the pictures associated with it. All right, I'm going to leave it open for anybody that needs it. So very simply, we kind of have to back into this answer. And what it's asking for is, what is the maximum wind velocity for a 30-degree crosswind if the maximum crosswind component for the airplane is 12 knots? Okay, so very simply, all we're going to do here is look at the 30-degree mark, and that's basically going to be represented by this line continuing down. And what you want to do, I think where most people make the mistake is they just assume 12 knots. So what they're doing is you're actually looking for 12 knots right here. And what we're actually trying to do is it's asking what is the maximum crosswind component based upon a 30 degrees from the runway, okay, or basically from the airplane. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually start over here. We've got 10 and 20. And because I'm doing this digitally, it may not match up 100%, but I'm just going to draw a straight line from what I think is roughly about 12 knots. So that should be about 12 knots. And then I'm going to follow this 30-degree mark down, okay, until it hits my line, okay? So at this point, what I can basically ballpark is where would the arc roughly be, okay? In this case, right here where my lines meet, because at this point this is be a 12 knot crosswind component, what is roughly this arc that's right in between 20 and 30? Okay, so in this case, the closest number that we have, it's definitely not 20, definitely not 16. The closest answer we've got is going to be roughly about 24, which should be about here. And if I were to basically continue that down, that's roughly where the 24 should be as well. Okay, we had about 30% of the class that got that answer correctly. Majority of you actually said B, which is 20 knots. That's a little bit too low. I don't know if you were looking at the sample problem there. Maybe that was kind of skewing your judgment. And then anybody that said A, that was 16, that's because you actually did this, where you basically continued to follow the 30 down until you got roughly to 12-ish, okay, somewhere around 12. And then you basically drew the line in the wrong direction there, okay? So let's try this one more time here. This is why I put 2 in. Practice makes perfect. All right, so here is another variation of that question. So using that same chart there, with a reported wind of north at 20 knots, which runway, 629 or 32, is acceptable for use for an airplane with a 13 knot maximum crosswind component? Just guessed. I'm in the middle of a death position. Okay. That's some serious multitasking there. As long as we got no doctors saying they're in the middle of surgery or something trying to multitask, I think we'll be good. Sorry for covering up the question there. Spicy Mike is asking, do you use this chart in the real world? Yes, you do. When you guys are student pilots, you will 100%, unless you have some off instructor, you will always, always, always have some type of crosswind limitation on your endorsement. Usually for my students, I put about 5 or 6 knots. So it's up to you to basically go out, listen to whatever the wind conditions are, however the runway is aligned at your airport, and then figure out what the crosswind is. If it exceeds your limitations that we gave you, then it's basically a no-go on your part unless we give you a new endorsement. Once you're a licensed pilot, it's not, it's not something that we do every single day, but you may, and you want to do this in the future, create your own personal limitations. So if you're not used to flying in crosswinds, you may want to say that I'm going to cap it at, 10 knots until I get more practice. All right, you got about 40% of the class in. And best way to practice, everyone, just go out with hopefully an instructor. Go to like a very windy area. The one that I used to take my students to is California City, which is pretty notorious for 20 to 30 knot crosswinds all the time. Or you can go out to Fox Field in the desert. And once you can line up with that center line and maintain it, do a bunch of touch and goes, then usually the principles stick. That's funny, Jake. All right, for those that are still filling it out, take your time, no worries. First thing you want to do is locate the 20 knot wind velocity arc on the figure here. So keep in mind that the 20, go to my little pencil here, the 20 knot arc is right here. So you guys can see that, quarter of a circle arc that we can see there. And then what we want to do is draw a line upward from the 13 knot crosswind component. Okay, so what we've got is this is basically 15. We've got 10 here. So we're kind of doing the exact same thing that we did in the previous one, except now we have to look at a few different examples. So what I'm going to do is I am basically just going to draw a line straight up, and that's going to be the best of my ability to represent the 13 knot crosswind, that we have that in there as a reference. And then the options that we have are going to be taking off from runway 6, 29, or 32. So which are the ones that are basically going to be within or either at or less than 13 knot crosswind. Okay. So very simply, you can go through each one of these. Runway 6 is going to basically be 060 degrees. Runway 32 is 320 and 29 is 290. Okay. So now that we have the actual magnetic numbers, the next thing is how is that going to apply where we have wind that's coming from the north, okay? So with wind from the north, remember north is basically 0 degrees, or you could call it 360 degrees. The difference between 360 and the value of 060, for example, is going to be 60 degrees. The difference between 360 and 320 in this case is actually going to be 40 degrees. And then the same thing applies. The difference between 360 and 290 is going to be 70 degrees. Okay. So now that we have the potential values, we can look at basically each one. So I'll go to the extreme one at the end, runway 29. I'll start with 70. And if I were to basically follow this down, we're basically looking at 20 knots here. So if I were to basically continue this line down to here, that's where the 20 knot marker is. And you can see that that's well above 13, right? That's definitely to the right of 13. So that's not going to work because it exceeds, in this case, our maximum crosswind component. Doing the exact same thing with runway, I'm going to go with runway 6, which is 60 degrees off. I'm going to follow that 60 degree line all the way down until it hits the 20, which is there. That's a little bit better, but once again, it's still exceeding 13 if I draw that line down. So we could see for runway 6, maybe about, a 17 knot crosswind. For runway 29, you're looking at maybe an 18 knot crosswind-ish. And then finally, our last one is going to be for runway 32, which is at 40 degrees. So I'm going to follow the 40 degree mark down till I get to the arc of 20 there. And it's probably very, very close to my line. If I didn't do it digitally, it probably matches. So best answer when we're looking at it will be B, which is for runway 32. About 63% of the class get that correct. Okay. All right, great job, everyone. So what we're going to do now is we're going to push on and finish up the weight and balance. We're basically going to take this step by step. We'll talk about some terms, then we'll go ahead and show you guys how to compute weight and balance, and also talk about the basically pros and cons of forward CG versus aft CG. But no matter what, if you guys are even take your pencil or pen and try to balance it on your finger, wherever it actually balances and doesn't tip over, that is the center of gravity, or CG for short. Okay. So typically for an airplane, we will have, we're basically have what is known as a CG envelope. And the CG envelope is something that's created by the manufacturer. It is approved by the FAA. And we basically need to have this CG within a given area. And it's basically plus or minus a value. Okay. We'll look at basically how to do this step by step. But let's first look at a few definitions that we need to know. So the first one is a BEW. This is your basic empty weight. This is your official weight and balance that's computed by a mechanic. So what this does include is it's the weight of the airplane itself, and then any optional equipment, unusable fuel, which is also provided in your manual as well. So the example that we're using today is we basically have a Cessna that has 56-gallon tanks, but only 53 gallons is usable. 3 gallons is unusable. Unusable fuel we can't actually account in our flight planning purposes. And this is fuel that essentially cannot be drained from the system. It also includes full operating fluids, including the full engine oil as well. The other ones that we've got is a gross landing weight, which is your takeoff weight less the fuel burned en route during your flight. We have our ramp weight. So once you put everything inside the plane, passengers, payload, fuel, and the actual airplane itself, that is your ramp weight before we actually turn on the engine and actually start burning fuel. A zero fuel weight is less, you don't see this as much unless you get into a larger aircraft, even a multi-engine. Some multis will have zero fuel weight. It's the weight of the aircraft before the addition of fuel. So it does include everything minus fuel at that point. Our gross takeoff weight is the weight of the airplane just before brake release to begin the takeoff roll. So typically this is right when you're cleared for takeoff. What is the weight going to be once we're actually rotating and the wheels are off the ground? Useful load is the weight that the airplane is actually capable of, holding between crew, passengers, baggage, and then also the fuel as well. Your maximum ramp weight is the maximum weight allowable by the manufacturer for any ground operations, so taxiing, those types of things. Your max takeoff weight is whatever your maximum takeoff weight is for your takeoff, and then your max landing weight is going to be basically the same thing, except it's based on the stress of the impact on the gear. A lot of times for most GA planes, your maximum takeoff and your maximum landing weights will be exactly the same. And then traditionally, you might have something like your max ramp weight on the plane that we were looking at the other day is like 2507, and your max takeoff weight is 2,500 pounds. And the assumption is that during your taxi, basically your start, taxi, and run up, you're going to burn 7 pounds off, which is approximately 1 gallon of fuel, which means that you'll be within the maximum takeoff weight. There's very few GA planes that have a landing weight, which is different than your maximum takeoff weight. If you get into Cirruses, they have them. Diamonds have them. Pretty much all, most business jets and airliners have them as well. We all hear the stories about, an airplane has to declare an emergency or come back to an airport sooner than they expected. And generally, your maximum takeoff weight is going to be far greater than your maximum landing weight. So what the larger airliners will do is basically dump fuel in the process in order to get the weight of that airplane down to whatever the manufacturer says for the landing weight. Okay. So the center of gravity, as I said, basically every single object that you have, you can basically try to balance at some point, and that would be considered the center of gravity. It's basically the specific point where the mass or weight of the aircraft may be said to be centered. And it's a point at which around, if the aircraft could be suspended or balanced, the aircraft would remain in place at any attitude. It's computed during the initial design and construction, and it's further affected by the installation of any type of equipment, and then aircraft loading, basically where we put people in there, and also other factors as well. CG is a major importance of the aircraft and its actual position. We were talking about this last night in our CFI class, and I think in the class I showed, we shared a video where there was a 747 that was taking off. It had military equipment on board. It was somewhere in the Middle East, and I think what they found out was the equipment became loose from basically where it was supposed to be tied down to. All the equipment basically went all the way to the aft portion of that 747, and it looked like it was pretty much nose up and going to just stall in place before it came, slashing, basically slamming down to the ground. Okay. So even if you, with weight and balance, it does need to be within the center of gravity limits. And I'll show you what that looks like here. So every single manufacturer will give you a chart that looks something like this on the right-hand side, and this is called your CG moment envelope, or for short, your CG envelope, okay? What you have here, kind of hard to see because it is in black, but basically within the confines of this right here, you want to compute a CG anywhere within that range, okay? And you can't have anything out here, or above those values. Okay, you never ever want anything that is basically just anywhere outside of your CG envelope. All right. What that actually looks like on an airplane, though, is it would look something very similar to this, where they're basically saying this is the most forward part and this is the most aft part. So this line right there, basically your front line, that is the forward part of the airplane, and then down here is basically the aft portion of the airplane. And what we have at the very bottom is going to be our, this is going to basically be our inches. You guys can see 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. And then we also have our weight on the vertical axis on the left-hand side as well. So we'll show you exactly how to do that, okay? If it's on the line, it is acceptable. Just realize that there are pros and cons if it is forward versus aft CG when we look at it. For those that are asking about utility versus normal category, we covered that in a little while ago, probably at the very beginning of the course, but normal category is just a normal category. It allows typically plus 4.4 Gs, and then I think it's like negative 2 Gs. Don't hold me to that. And then the utility category allows a little bit more in terms of positive and negative values. And then the utility category, depending on the manufacturer, you can usually do more maneuvers in that aircraft, but it's got to be within that specified zone of the utility category. Certain airplanes you can spin intentionally, but it does have to be in the utility category as well. I think Alex will explain it to you guys a little bit better there. All right, so here are your pros and cons with the aft CG versus forward CG. So without going into the mechanics or the aerodynamics of it, just kind of note the bullet points on the left-hand side. If we have a aircraft with aft CG loading, the aircraft is going to be less stable along the longitudinal axis. It will have a higher true airspeed, which will also give you a higher ground speed. It will require increased tail down forces, and then should the aircraft stall or spin, it's actually going to be more difficult to recover without, it's actually difficult, if not impossible, to recover from a stall or spin in these circumstances, okay? Very simply, if you guys had an airplane, I showed this exact same thing in the CFI class last night. We got our little miniature airplane right here, and all of the weight was in the back. And this is obviously a very extreme example. What would we have to do to get this thing to fly straight and level, right? I would take the yoke and I would push it all the way to the firewall, and then this plane would actually be able to fly like this, right? And it's not ideal. Now, the first thing that happens is if we ever get into a stall, one of the things we want to do is lower the nose to break the stall, get more air, basically more airflow over those wings, and also increase the power. Problem is that I'm already holding that yoke to the firewall, so I can't actually break it, and that's the problem. It is difficult, if not impossible, to break that stall. If I end up in a spin, even though that the aircraft is pretty much pointing straight down, we still have to push the nose even further down in order to get out of that spin. So that's the reason why we usually talk about that. Same thing happens in the opposite case, and keep in mind it's the most extreme, just to kind of prove a point or kind of exaggerate it. If we have all the weight in the nose, so I don't know, maybe we're carrying some cinder blocks and we're looking like this. In order to get that nose up, I got to basically pull that yoke back and hold it at my chest, and now the airplane is perfectly level, okay? The problem with that is when I come in for a landing, as the speed basically decreases, that nose is going to want to start to drop. And with that, I am more likely, and it may be difficult once again, if not impossible, to flare, basically bring that nose up. And what could end up happening is you could end up with either a prop strike or ending up landing on that nose wheel, which we don't want as well. Okay, so just kind of think of it that way, if that kind of helps. So with your forward CG loading, the aircraft will be more stable along the longitudinal axis. You get a little bit lower true airspeed and ground speed. And what we mean by higher or lower is literally like plus or minus 3 knots. You're not getting like 30 knots or anything. You will have that nose heavy feeling in there. You will require longer takeoff distances just due to the fact that more airflow is required to provide more force to lift a heavy nose. You will have a higher stall speed as well due to the fact that we've got the airflow deflection of the elevator that's required to maintain the altitude at the slower speeds, which actually gives you a higher angle of attack. Okay. Continuing on, another thing that we always try to avoid, and you don't ever want to take off in an overweight aircraft, is something like this. Obviously, this is just a loading issue. They probably loaded too much without pushing the weight forward. A lot of these big airplanes like this, like the 737s, you'll be at the airport. They actually have like these little, I don't know, they look like these yellow sticks that basically hold up the tail to prevent this type of thing. But you never, ever, ever want to fly with an overweight aircraft, okay? The limitations of flying with too much weight are going to be longer takeoff runs, longer takeoff rolls. You're going to use a lot more runway than what you would normally expect. You're going to need a higher or faster takeoff speed. You're going to get a reduced angle of climb and rate of climb. You're going to get a reduced cruising speed, shorter range, higher stalling speeds, and that longer landing roll as well. The only time that I could think of if you actually need to take off overweight is for the ferry pilots that are maybe, taking a plane from the Pacific to, somewhere out in Hawaii, or maybe they're doing the Atlantic Pacific runs over to Europe. In those cases, they need to carry extra fuel in order to actually make it. And anytime that they do so, they actually have to go to the FAA to get a special ferry permit to do it. Okay, so other than that, there really should be no other time that you guys should be taking off overweight at any point in time. Tail stand. Thanks, Steve. They are called tail stands. Little yellow sticks. And they're not really sticks. They're more like, some type of metal, aluminum, some type of pole that holds them up. In the event that you ever need to shift weight, you can use what is known as the weight shift formula. So anytime that we wanted to add or subtract weight from a loaded airplane, and we wanted to move it, let's assume like we already figured out our weight and balance, and the main thing is we want to figure out how is it going to change our center of gravity if I maybe move this person from the back seat to the front seat. How will that actually change without actually computing everything again? So very simply, I give you an example here. We have an airplane that weighs 8,600 pounds. That's the total weight of the aircraft. And we want to basically shift something 100 pounds from basically a station or an arm. We're going to talk more about stations and arms here in a second. But essentially what we're doing is we're basically going to move them from, let's say, the front seat to the back seat. So we're moving them from 100 inches to 150 inches. So essentially we're moving them about 50 inches in a certain direction. What you can do is you can use the formula at the very bottom here, and then it's just a simple cross multiplication. So the weight to be shifted in this case is 100 pounds. Then you put that over the total weight of the airplane, which is 8,600 pounds. What we're trying to do is we're trying to solve for X here, which is what would be our change in CG. And then we know the distance that the CG is to shift because we're actually moving this, whatever this is, 50 inches, okay? If you guys remember from your high school math class, you're basically going to cross multiply. So in this case, I'm basically going to take 50 times 100, okay? And then I'm going to divide that by 8,600 pounds, and that is going to equal X, okay? I grab my little calculator here. That means that it is basically going to be, so it gives me about 0.58. I'm just going to kind of round up here a little bit. I am just going to say, for simplicity's sake, that it's going to be roughly 0.6. Okay, so it's going to be roughly about 0.6 inches. I don't know if I can measure tenths when I'm looking at these. Okay, failed math, I know. Now, anytime that we look at an airplane, we always need to know where the datum is, and the datum is basically an arbitrary location that the manufacturers provide to us within the flight manuals. For most Pipers out there, the datum is actually the very, very front of the airplane, which is going to be the spinner, and then for pretty much every Cessna, for the most part, it's going to be the firewall, which separates basically the cockpit from the actual engine section of there. Keep in mind, you always want to go ahead and go into the weight and balance section, figure out where the datum is located. So right here in this example for this Cessna, we can clearly see that it is located right here at the firewall. Certain airplanes, like the C-130, the datum is actually about 15 feet in front of the airplane, just for no reason. Certain airplanes also have the datum at the wing root, kind of a little bit further in. Now, the purpose of the datum is it's basically where we can start measuring. And what you're going to notice is that this is where we come up with these arm values. So in this example here, this is the 0 point because we're right on the datum. As I work my way backwards towards the tail, these are positive values, and these are based in inches. So we've got 50 inches, 100 inches, 150, 250 is pretty much towards the very tail of the aircraft. Anything forward of the datum is going to be a negative value. So this is negative 50 and negative 100. Some, like the Pipers, they won't have negative values. So it might just be positive values from the spinner all the way back to the airplane. Okay. The weight and balance problem that we're going to look at in terms of how to set it up, I'm just going to give you a quick example. This is what it should look like, and we'll fill this out as we run through it. We'll start off with our basic empty weight. We're going to compute or figure out what the weights are of the individuals that we're flying with, and then also our baggage and how much fuel we're going to take. That will then give us a ramp weight. We will then have a gross takeoff weight and a gross landing weight. Now, the only two values that we really care about in terms of calculating at the end of the day is making sure that our gross weights are going to be within our limitations. And then we also want to figure out whatever our CG values are when we take off and then also when we land. Very simply, all this is a very simple math problem. It's weight times arm equals moment. Weight times arm equals moment, okay? So all you would do is if I've got 1 and then 2, 1 times 2 equals 2, okay? So that's all you're gonna do is you basically go across. The arm is gonna be the distance away from the datum, the inches away from the datum. And we're gonna find out what are the arms based upon the information that the manufacturer provides us. So the first thing that we need to do is figure out the basic empty weight of the aircraft, and we do this from the official weight and balance that's provided to us by the mechanic. So I scratched out the mechanic stuff in here, but if you guys look at the bottom here, you can see that it looks like there's a swap between audio panels. We have our weight, we have our arm, which is our new CG point with nothing in it, and then we have our moment. So that's really our starting point. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this information and basically have the weight and the moment added in there. We don't care about the arm because the moment is already basically calculated for us. Okay, here's the last slide. Anyone needed it? Mike is saying the Black Hawk datum is over 100 inches forward of the helicopter. Yeah, so it's just an arbitrary point. You good, Gene, with that? All right, now that we've figured out the basic empty weight of the airplane, that's really our starting point for what we're going to do. And then I'm going to basically take a survey of, hopefully people will give me the correct answer, how much they weigh. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be flying from Camarillo up to San Francisco. It's roughly a 3.5 4 hour flight, depending on the weather. We have the pilot at $1.85. Our passengers telling us they're 165. We're going to figure out if there's anything in their back seat. So if you are maybe bringing your flight bag or some luggage, figure out where exactly you're putting it. Most people, students accidentally list it as the baggage area. The reality is that nobody ever puts their flight bag in the baggage area. We usually put it in the seat behind us, okay? The baggage area as well. Some aircraft have multiple baggage areas. So some of the Cessnas, they usually have like a lower section and then kind of like your hat rack at the top there. That's kind of, baggage area 1 and then baggage area 2. So just kind of make sure that you are, accounting for things in the correct location. Now with the baggage area, most of the rental and flight schools out there, don't just assume it's 0. A lot of flight schools, they put oil and bags and cleaner and, chocks and tie downs and all sorts of stuff in the back. You can guesstimate to your best ability what that might weigh by basically looking at it there. Now, inside of the weight and balance section of your POH and AFM, you're going to find a chart that looks just like this in figure 6.3. And this is where we get our arms. And these are also known as stations. So basically, we have a certain location or a station where the pilot and passengers are going to sit, the rear passengers, and so forth. So what we do is we can see our arms right here. It's 37 inches, and you'll also notice that it goes 34 to 46. So maybe if everyone's really short and can't reach the pedals, everybody will be slide up in the most forward position, which would be 34. You might have someone tall like me in the very aft position, which means that it is 46. So the average normal amount that people will use is 37, but maybe if you have two tall people, you can absolutely use the higher values, but that's the range based upon the seat tracks and movement. We have 73 for our rear passengers or anything that happens to be in the rear seat. We've got the baggage area, which is in 95. The 108 is just telling us at 108 inches, that's the difference or where the start and end point is. The end point for area 1 and the start for area 2. And then the very, very tail end is 142, which is basically the end of baggage area 2. So these are the values that we're going to do. The important thing you want to do or read here is always read the notes. You'll notice that the fuel is completely missing from this image, but if you read note 1, it says the usable fuel CG arm for the tanks is located at station 48. So all of our fuel that is going to go into the aircraft, regardless if it's right tank or left tank, will be at station 48 or 48 inches from the arm. So very simply, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put down all those weights that we just computed there, and I'm going to basically migrate those arms onto the chart. That's going to be your first step. Now, there is something I've got to do with the fuel. Assuming that we're taking full tanks, which is 53 gallons, then I need to actually figure out how to convert gallons into pounds. The standard numbers that we have on the left are avgas is roughly 6 pounds per gallon. Jet fuel or turbine fuel is 6.7 per gallon. Oil is 7.5. And as a reference there, water is 8.35 pounds. So what I'm going to do is we are flying a piston. So I'm going to take 53 gallons, multiply it by 6 pounds. And instead of writing 53, I'm going to put the weight there of 318 pounds. Now, where is the arm, or how am I pulling out the arm? We're going to go back to the note section here, and that is where the arm is located, which is 48 inches. Okay. The next step is basically your arithmetic step for this next section here. So very, very simply, the first thing that you want to do is basically multiply weight times arm equals moment, and you're basically just going to keep going across until you basically have all of the values totaled. Okay, basically you're going to have moments on the left-hand side at that point. Step number 2 is you're going to add up all of the weights within the weight column for your ramp weight. You're also going to add up all of your moments in the moment column for your total moment. You cannot add up your arms. You cannot add up your arms. If I added up my arms and I had my little airplane right here, however that, I don't know how that looks like an airplane. If I added up all my arms and this is my datum, basically you're talking about a point that's well beyond the actual aircraft itself. Okay, it doesn't exist. The next step, once we have this process done, is now we're actually going to look at our fuel burn for taxi, takeoff, and start and figure out what would be our takeoff weight. We do this by using the time, fuel, and distance to climb chart. If we actually looked at this for the Cessna, which is what we're going to use here after the break as well, it says add 1.1 gallons of fuel for engine start, taxi, and takeoff allowance. So that is our baseline in the event you're at a busier airport. Maybe you're flying at a Van Nuys and you know it always takes 30 minutes to get off the ground. You can always increase that value. We're going to go with the book value here. Once again, I can't use 1.1, so I'm going to multiply that by 6 pounds. That gives me my 6.6. I know that it's at station 48 because that's where the fuel is located. And then in this case, what I've got is 6.6 times 48 equals a moment. Now, the trick here is that we are reducing the weight, right? So whatever you want to do, if you're an accountant, use your brackets. If you're not an accountant, put a minus sign in there so you remember. We are subtracting 6.6 pounds from the ramp weight. We're also subtracting 316.8 from the actual total moment that we have so far. We're going to go ahead and continue this process here. So here is the last one that we did. And what that will give us is a gross takeoff weight. And we want to obviously make sure that we're under whatever the limitation is. For this airplane, it happens to be 2,500 pounds. So we're good to go. We're going to figure out what is our fuel burn based upon a flight plan that we calculated. In this case, we assume based upon the flight plan, we're going to use 40 gallons at 6 pounds per gallon. So by the time we land, if everything goes well, you will be 240 pounds lighter. Once again, it is all coming out of station 48 because that is where the fuel is located. I'm going to subtract the moment, and then I come up with a landing weight of 2137.8, and then I have this moment value. From there, what I need to do is I am going to do some simple division. And what I don't really care about a CG for a ramp weight. That's kind of not what I would want to do. What I want to do is look at these two values here. And remember, weight times arm equals moment. Moment divided by weight equals your center of gravity. Okay, so basically I'm taking the first value of moment, dividing it by the weight. And what I've come up with is 41.4, which is basically, remember that datum that we talked about before? What we're saying is that that CG point is, in this case, 41.4 inches away from the datum. Doing the exact same thing with our landing CG, we have our weight and our moment. So we're going to divide the 86,000 by the 2,100 pounds. So we've got the moment divided by weight, and then we get our landing CG of 40.65. What we're going to do at these values is we're going to come over to our CG envelope, and depending on what your airplane has, it may look slightly different than what you have. I highlighted it in pink in terms of so you can see the outline a little bit better. So what you're going to do is you're going to start off at the bottom. What we've got is 41.4 inches, which is here. And you would basically follow that up, and you're trying to match roughly 2377, which is here. And that's how we come up with that red star. And then upon landing, we're looking at 40.65. And we have a weight slightly higher than 2137, and that's where our gold star is. If you did everything correctly, you would obviously have something that would look like this. And typically what happens in flight is between your takeoff and your landing CG, your CG will actually move down and forward. Because remember that this is basically the spinner over here, and this is the tail on this side, on the right-hand side, okay? So everything, and that's basically what we're looking for. If you are kind of on the limits, or if you maybe want to move things around, maybe you have 200 pounds of baggage that you thought you could get in the baggage compartment. Now you need to move it to the back seat, whatever you need to do with that. Okay. So you guys can watch this over again. We've got a lot of stuff to cover, unfortunately. So we're going to go ahead and move on. Let me go ahead and show you this. This is basically the law of the lever before we take a break here. And I want to see if you guys can figure this out, but just going to give you guys some hints here. What we have are known values. And when we look at questions like this in the book, this is considered basically the datum, or basically in this case, just the center point. So what we're looking for is everything to the left of that dotted line needs to equal everything to the right of the dotted line. Okay. And the numbers that we are given in this case, don't want to do that. The numbers that we're given in this case are actually going to be the 500 here, and then the other one. Okay, so get out of that. And then we also have the plank weight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up real quick. There we go. And let you guys see if you guys can figure this out. We want to get the left side to equal the right side, and the values that we have are we've got a weight of 250 pounds at 20 inches, 500 pounds at 15 inches, and then we have a plank of 200 pounds at 45 inches, okay? So how do we get the left side to equal the right side? All right, got the first couple of answers in for the book for Rod Machado. It's in the weight and balance section. So if you want to look that up, that is chapter 16 in his book. And Mike in Florida, yeah, that's one of the problems with the Bonanzas. Pilots were calculating the CG shift. or they weren't. Sorry, weren't. The fulcrum is that little triangle at the bottom. Yeah, a lot of people have problems with these, and once you see how to solve it, it's actually very, very easy. So you guys can do it in your sleep. I got about half the class in so far. All right, I will leave it open for anybody that is still best guessing this. But very, very simply, like I said, we want the left-hand side to equal the right-hand side based upon the fulcrum, which is this point right there. So what it is you can set this up as a very simple math problem at the end of the day. What we have are known values, but the question is how should the 500-pound weight, right? How should the 500-pound weight be shifted? Do we even need to shift it? Obviously, it needs to be shifted because they wouldn't give us these answers an inch to the left, an inch to the right, or 4.5 inches right or left. Okay, so even though it's currently at 15 inches, we're basically going to treat this as an unknown value because we don't know what it needs to be. So this is basically going to be X at this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically take 500X, okay, and then I'm going to put an equal sign because I want to figure out what we've got on the right-hand side here. And what I have is 250-pound weight. So I'm going to do 250. I know it's at 20 inches. And then I also need to add the plank weight of 200. And this is actually at 45 inches. Okay. I'm sorry, 15 inches. Calculating the wrong one here. The total length is 45. So it's actually at 15 inches because that's where the CG point is. All right, from here, very simple. It's just going to be math. So what I've got on this side is going to be 500x is going to equal 8,000. I'm going to divide out the 500, both sides. Okay, and then I've got x is going to equal 16 inches. Okay, so based upon 16 inches, we can go back to our 500-pound weight here, right? And now we know what it should be. So currently it's at 15 inches, and now what the answer is telling us is it actually needs to be at 16 inches, so it actually needs to slide over till it gets 16 inches, which means that it's going to move 1 inch to the left. Okay, does everyone follow that? Okay, 1 inch to the left. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We have a lot of stuff to cover when we come back, so be ready to rock and roll here, but I'll see everybody back in 10. have your E6B, some type of E6B. I gave you guys in the chat here the electronic one that I'm going to be sharing with, which is from University of North Dakota. And there is two sides to it. We're also going to be talking about our plotters as well. These are aviation plotters. They come in different sizes and shapes. This is also, if you have the LA sectional, you're more than welcome to pull it out. If you don't, you can follow along on skyvector.com. We're going to go from airport to airport. This is kind of a mini cross country. I think it's just barely 50 nautical miles. But this is something where we're going to go through like the principles of what we're actually putting into the boxes, how to do the calculations. The reality is that yes, we could make this like a 6 or 7 hour class. We just don't unfortunately have the amount of time to do that. The other document that you will need as well is going to be some type of flight plan, whether you want to use the one that we provided, which is basically your Jepson flight plan. This is one that was filled out by a student here. Or if you have another flight plan that you're using, you could do this in Excel. You could create your own document. There's a lot of different flight companies out there that either create these. The most common one that I see is the Jepson branded one. Okay. If you guys are following along with an electronic E6B, just make sure you guys understand what the functionality is. They are easier, but they do have their downfalls just because of the fact that sometimes you can get lost in the menus, and if you input a wrong number at one point, sometimes that can screw it up, and it can take you a while to kind of go back and figure out wherever that transgression happened. Okay. Other than that, let's go ahead and jump into it. And when I were talking about these things, I want to kind of go back to the very, very basics here. And yes, this does take a while. And I promise you it will get easier. I think I can do a flight plan in like 20 or 30 minutes by hand. So this is what an electronic flight plan is. And a lot of people will come to us and say, why can't I just use this, right? And the reality is I mean, this is great for the purposes of getting from point to point. And this is actually the flight plan that we have tonight. And for me, it was just as simple as one click and it gave me the answer based upon the current weather. And it calculated everything for me, right? And the reality is that it will do a better job and a faster job than by doing it by hand. The problem with that is during check rides and so forth, we had this conversation also in the CFI class last night. What is the difference between these numbers and how were these numbers computed by the system? And most people aren't able to answer that. On your check ride, it is very, very wise and helpful if you go in with a handwritten copy of your flight plan. Once you guys are done with your private pilot license, then you can do the electronic stuff to your heart's content like this. And this is pretty much the reality of what we do. But if you show up with a document like this, I guarantee you they're going to ask you every single question under the sun. How did you calculate this? Can you show me how to calculate this on an E6B? And then these documents usually put in a lot of other information, like all of these charts down at the bottom that you're not necessarily going to have if you were just calculating a handwritten navigation on your own. Okay. I know it's easy to click the button, but the reality is that you need to know why each one of these numbers is here in each one of these columns and how the computer is actually setting it up. Okay. So before we begin, I just want to kind of just jog your memory a little bit from last week in terms of the types of navigation. We are going to be dealing with 3 different types of navigation, right? The purpose of this class is dead reckoning, which is basically computing time, fuel, and distance from point to point. Okay, so in a given route, we might have, 5, 10, 20 different waypoints. And between each one of those waypoints, we will basically figure out how much time is it going to take, how much fuel is it going to take, and what is the distance between point A and B. What you want to do is anytime that we're planning a flight, we want to basically try to get, and this is what I tell students, try to get at least 2 out of those 3 for navigation. So what I mean by that is pilotage, remember, is looking out the window and comparing what's out the window with what's on your map. Dead reckoning is what we're going to be doing today, putting together a flight plan and having all of the calculations. Thanks, Dave. And then we also have radio navigation as well. So you can always back up whatever you're doing with something else. Remember, like we said, there are GPS outages or maybe a VOR system's down in your area. So you want to have something else that you can rely on. There should be no excuse in terms of, not knowing where you are at all times based upon the amount of information that you have available at your fingertips. So What I usually say is you should be able to get 2 out of these 3. In some circumstances, you could probably get 3 out of the 3. And what I mean by that, this is going to be our flight for today, is if I am going to be flying, let's assume we're right here by the Air Force Base, okay? I could easily use the, what is that, Vandenberg Air Force Base right there as a pilotage point, because I could look out my left-hand window and see the giant runways, you know, from my position. It doesn't mean I need to fly directly over it. That's pilotage. I should also have the information from the Dead Reckoning because of the fact that I will have the time, fuel, and distance information. And I could potentially also back it up by, you know, maybe flying this radial right here as well. I could have potentially 3 out of the 3, okay? That's what we mean by, you know, using the different resources you have available. Try to always have a backup of something. So pilotage is the easiest one. And then obviously elect some type of radio navigation of some form, GPS, VOR system, whatever you're ending up using. That's what we're basically trying to do. With your waypoints should be somewhere between 25 and 35 nautical miles in distance from each other. Keep in mind, this is just a general rule. If you were to fly, let's say, east of Las Vegas, there's nothing to look at. You might have a waypoint every 50 nautical miles. So it might be something other than the norm or outside of the norm, just because of the fact that there's not a lot to choose from once you get to certain parts of the country, okay? But a waypoint could be anything, right? A waypoint could be an airport. It could be a navigational aid, a river. It could be a town. It could be, you know, pretty much anything. It could be even a freeway that you're overflying that maybe bends at a certain area. For the purposes of today, we're going to be flying a Cessna 172 Romeo model. It's a 2001. The documentation for this aircraft in terms of all the performance information that we're pulling is found right beneath this live class right now. It's under selected. It's called like selected performance for the 172. We're going to be flying or taking off from Santa Ynez, California, which is Kiza, which is just down here. It's actually a class Gulf airport from surface to 700 feet, then becomes class Echo. There is no control tower at either one of these, and we're going to end up at Paso Robles Airport, very top here, which is KPRB. We had an anticipated departure time of 6 p.m. Obviously, we'll throw it for like 6:40 or something. It's a relatively short flight. The total distance is 69 nautical miles for the straight line distance. And one of the things that we always look at when we're doing this is, you know, we want to kind of survey the route and kind of figure out how are we going to get from point A to point B. Obviously, the fastest way is just a straight line. The reality is that that may not be the safest solution to getting over to Paso Robles today. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna, before we kind of look at the route and you guys look at this information, I'll introduce you guys to the navigation log here. So this is your nav log. They come in different shapes, sizes, and different formats. But the center part of this, basically from the checkpoints all the way to the green section there, is always going to be the same. The airport ATIS and the frequencies, some publishers add that information in, and you can, you know, fill it out or not. So with the navigation log, we always pretty much start on the left-hand side, and the goal is to kind of work our way to the right-hand side. And there is a specific order. You can't necessarily jump from one thing to another. And the reason why I color-coded it is it depends really what side of the E6B we're on and kind of what are we actually doing. So most of the information before we get going can actually be pulled from our weather report and then also our performance information. And then once we have all of the values that we need to, that are basically we need to compute or anything else, then what we can do is we can actually do the calculations and everything else along the way. Everything in the blue that you guys see there, that is actually done using our aviation plotter. So with the aviation plotter, and I'll show you guys exactly how to do this, you would basically figure out our course, and then we have our distance, and you could basically populate that information at the exact same point. And once we, you know, that's kind of our starting point once we know our checkpoints and everything else, okay? The next section that you guys see on the screen there is this orangish, reddish color, and that is where we actually start using the E6B. You're going to see the abbreviations that we'll talk about where we've got true course, true heading, magnetic heading, which is the TC, TH, and MH at the very top. And we're going to go through what all those mean and how to actually compute those. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using the wind side, basically this side of your E6B. It's the one that basically spins. And we are basically trying to figure out a wind correction angle. What should we fly in order to maintain a certain ground track? This section in the green is basically the very last thing that we're going to be doing today, and that's on the flight computer side, and that basically looks just on the opposite side of your wind side. And all of those calculations, your estimated time en route, your fuel burn for each leg, we're going to be able to compute that on the back side there. But very simply, you kind of need, no matter what, with all the white stuff that's outstanding, you would pretty much fill that stuff out before you start moving on to the other colors of the rainbow here. So traditionally what we would do is we would do the course and the distance, which is in blue. Then we would start to migrate to our wind side of the E6B, which is that orange section. And then after that, we basically finish it up with the green section going across. If you want to kind of get that in your mind, what type of order it would look like. Okay. So with that, keep in mind, just have a couple copies out. Go ahead and use a pencil, please. And the very first thing that we want to do, once we have all of our materials out, is first try to figure out what route we would want to take, right? So we could select a checkpoint, and we've talked about checkpoints roughly every 25 to 35 nautical miles. You want to incorporate how you're going to navigate. So that's obviously going to be dead reckoning. So that's the time, fuel, and distance calculations that we're doing. And also we want to basically look at the other methods of navigation. How can we incorporate pilotage? And then how also can we incorporate any type of radio navigation that we may be using? Okay. So if you guys are following along on SkyVector, you can go to skyvector.com, and in the upper left-hand corner of SkyVector, which looks just like this, you guys will see this flight plan button. So in the event you don't see it, just click the flight plan button here. You can put in the departure airport of San Ynez, K-I-Z-A, and then our destination of Paso Robles. And very simply, the electronic ones are kind of cool. I'm going to have you guys do this manual way. You can move the pink line wherever you want it to, and it will basically allow you to, put in a waypoint or a GPS or anything else that you want. Okay. So when we are looking at our, basically surveying the route, the things that I'm looking at is number one is what is the safest way? Okay. What I mean by that is, based upon the terrain and everything else that's going on here, if I were to follow this pink line, which is the most direct, if I lost an engine at any point in time, I am probably going to be screwed. Okay. I'm not going to make it to Santa Maria Airport over here. Okay. That's probably within gliding distance. Maybe I can't get to Oceano over here. That's outside. Santa Luis or San Luis Obispo is also out of range. So one of the things that we always think about is going to be how can we make this flight safely, or how can we basically reduce or mitigate our risk in any way. And one of the things we can do is we can fly closer to airports, or even use airports as waypoints by flying directly over them. So in the event that we did lose an engine, what would end up happening is we would pretty much be within gliding distance of an airport. Now here in California, that's very easy to do. If you are in other parts of the country in mountainous terrain, or like I said, if you're east of Vegas, you're not going to have a lot of options in order to maybe do that. But we always want to think about, what are some of the things that we, how can we make this safer at the end of the day? Then I'm also going to start looking at the terrain. So we have our maximum elevation figures here. This is 552. So basically within this bounds of lat and long, we've got the highest obstacles going to be 5,200 feet, with basically rounded up by 100 there, so not much. We have 5.3 in this next one. And then our final chunk here, we've got 4.7 up here, and we have 3.9 over here. So really the highest obstacle, even if I went direct, is really going to be around 5,300 feet-ish. And obviously if I were to move my pink line closer to the coast and fly over these airports, the terrain is actually, it goes down substantially as well. So before I even pull my weather information, there's a couple things that I need to know in terms of how do I want to navigate to this airport? And then also, what altitude do I want to use as a starting off point to grab my weather? So in this case, also based upon the direction of travel, we are basically pretty much north. What is this? This is going to be about northwest bound. Here is the direct line, which is 325 degrees. and I can cheat a little bit here. So remember, between 0 and 179, if you're east, you're odd. So it's an odd 1,000 plus 500. And then everywhere else, we are an even. So what I could say is 4-5, definitely too low. I could do 6-5, I could do 8-5, I could do 10-5. So for my weather aspect, I'm just going to run with 6-5 and then see what comes out. And if the winds are, maybe the winds suck at 6,500 and I want to go higher, I can absolutely change that later on. Before you guys actually do this, though, you kind of want to have a game plan in terms of what, how you're going to actually come up with your route, what altitudes you want to fly. And then what will end up happening is you're going to move on to your weather brief once you kind of have the basic outline of your route. So for me, because safety is paramount and I don't necessarily want to fly direct over kind of this mountainous area. Also, if you're ever unsure of, sometimes these look just fine, like it doesn't look too bad flying over, basically following this pink line. I would encourage you to do this, and I do this for CFI students. We go to Google Earth, right? And we go to the satellite view, and then magically when they see this, they're all like mountaintops with trees and all sorts of stuff that if you did lose an engine, you're basically not like this is very flat land, even though it looks pretty harmless from this view, okay? So use other outside resources, especially if you're less familiar with, your location or area. And then what you can do is you can basically try to figure out how do you want to navigate. Now, besides just kind of figuring out a general route, I am just going to kind of move my line here over Santa Maria. I'm just going to fly airport to airport. Okay. I like that. I like flying over airports or next to airports. It does provide a bit more safety. I'm not necessarily going to fly directly over San Luis Obispo, but I could just move my line just a little bit over. Of course, we're going to do this on paper as well. Okay, so this is just really to kind of look at getting a weather report. So in this case, I have something that looks kind of like that as a general idea. That may not be like set in stone, but that'll give me a pretty good start in terms of the information that I need in order to do the next step, which is going to grab my weather report. Okay. Now, the other things too is before we actually, and this is the number one thing that I see with students is you guys get really excited. And this is how we waste a lot of paper, is you guys start putting in your waypoints. Okay, I am taking off from Kiza. Then he said we're going to Santa Maria. Then we're going to be going to X, Y, Z, VOR. Okay, before you start filling out everything, I like to get all my numbers up front. This is something I've learned after doing this a couple hundred times. So the other information that we're going to calculate before we even put anything on this document is we are going to calculate what is known as a TOC, which basically stands for a top of climb value. Okay, that's basically how long is it going to take us to get from our airport to, in my example, 6,500 feet when I can just basically fly straight and level. Okay, out the flip side of that, as we're getting into Paso Robles, PRB, we need to calculate something called a TOD, which is the reverse. I'm at 6,500. Question is when am I going to start my descent for Paso Robles? And that's basically called a top of descent. Okay. So once I calculate my top of climb, my top of descent, I'm going to show you guys exactly what you need to pull out of the weather packet that we're going to look at. Then I actually start putting pencil to paper here and laying out the flight plan. So try not to jump ahead too much. Otherwise, you're going to realize that you might miss a step in between. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to actually look at our weather briefing. So if you want to follow along, you can do so on the screen and do this afterwards. If you want to try to follow along while we're doing it, this is going to be the process. You can go to 1-800-WXbrief.com. We're going to use the flight service station briefing tool. It is a pretty cool tool that they have there. If you want to use something else, you're more than welcome to. And then from there, you guys are then going to create an account. If you don't have an account, you can create one for free. And then you're going to go to Flight Planning and Briefing, which is this center tab right here. It's right there. There's a drop-down menu. And then very simply, you're going to go to Briefings, Flight Plans, and Navlogs. Okay. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you exactly how to fill this out line by line. And the reason why I said it's good to kind of a general idea of what to fill out is it will ask you, what is your, route of flight? It's also going to need some information such as what is your, cruising speed and your altitude. Now for the cruising speed, I'm just going to give it to you. We're going to say 120 knots just because we know that value. But I'll show you exactly where to find that in the near future here as we look at the cruise performance in flight. Okay. So the first step is we're going to go ahead and scooter over to our weather website. And like I said, if you guys want to follow along, you're more than welcome to. If you want to sign up for an account, you can do so as well. So once you actually log in, this is the home page of what you should be seeing on there. And it has all of the same stuff that it basically incorporates with a lot of the other services. So it does grab a lot of the same information from aviationweather.gov. It does give you local conditions and other things like that. But what we're going to do, like I said, is we're going to go to Plan and Brief. And then you're going to go ahead and click on Plan and Brief. It's the first one in the drop-down menu under Plan and Brief. From this is actually going to give you, it defaults to the ICAO, which is basically your international flight plan. The FAA domestic is still available, but they want us to teach you the ICAO one here. So very simply, we'll go through this line by line. A lot of these things are codified. In the event that you want the paper version of this, you guys want to know like what the coding is. If you have a copy of your AIM available, it is in chapter number 4, I believe, or 5. It's chapter 5 of the AIM. It's the first couple sections, and they'll tell you all the different codes that you would need to know in order to basically plug in this information. If you're just on there following along right now, if you basically leave your mouse over any one of these, it will it'll populate whatever the ICAO field is. It'll tell you how to actually fill it out, or you can actually click on it, and there will be a little dialog box that opens that will tell you exactly what to do for whatever the section is. For us, we're going to start off with the aircraft ID. You guys can put in your own aircraft ID, but in my case, I'm going to put 764 Charlie Papa. Then what we've got is our flight rules. So we have VFR, IFR, and our Canadian friends up there. So we're going to do VFR today. Our flight type. So we have a couple different types. So really, for most of us, it's going to be general, which is G. The DVFR is the Defense VFR flight plan. So if you are maybe coming back into the United States, you would have to file a DVFR flight plan or an IFR flight plan. And with that, that's basically telling the U.S. government that your aircraft is crossing at this specific point, plus or minus, I can't remember if it's 10 or 15 minutes from whatever that time is. So for us, we are just general aviation. So we're going to go to a G here. We are a single aircraft. If we were maybe doing a formation flight or something else, we would actually add additional aircraft there. The aircraft type for today is going to be a Cessna 172. If you knew the codification, you can always put in a Cessna 172, or for any of those that you don't know, click on the magnifying glass and basically start typing. So I'm just going to put in Cessna 172. Let's actually just do Cessna and see if I can find it that way. These are a little bit temperamental with their searches. So we've got 150s, 152s. I'm going to go with the 172 Skyhawk here. And you could put in whatever associated aircraft that you have. So with this, I'm going to go ahead and click select, and it will drop the aircraft code in the aircraft type. It automatically associates that aircraft with the wake turbulence category. Pretty much all general aviation is going to be considered light. If you want to think about it this way, heavy is 74s, A380s, 757s, mediums would be like the Embraer Airs and the other aircraft out there. So we should pretty much all be under the L category. Your aircraft equipment is basically what type of equipment do you have installed in your aircraft? Very simply, just click the magnifying glass on the right. If most of us will probably have a couple of these. So for example, you might have distance measuring equipment here. You might have, if you're old school, you might have an ADF installed, an automatic direction finder. You might have a GNSS, which is a GPS system. You might have a VOR. Okay, so just select the equipment that is applicable for your type of aircraft. Those would probably be the most common ones for general aviation. All this CPDLC stuff, this is cockpit data link controllers. These are mainly like text messaging systems and those types of things where you can get digital copies of information. These are like, we're talking millions of bucks to install one of these. Once you're satisfied with you're basically covered whatever letters of the alphabet correspond to the equipment you have on board, go ahead and click the OK button, and it will actually drop the letters in the aircraft equipment list. Over on the right-hand side, on the second line, we're going to go ahead and put in our departure airport of KIZA, which is our airport code. Then we're going to do a departure date and time. Now, if you had a specific time, you could basically plug that in and you could do a local time. You could do Zulu time, whatever time zone you happen to be in. For me, just so we could do it easily, I'm going to put it for 15 minutes from now. So I'm just going to put my time in here. I'm going to apply it and it will automatically say that 15 minutes from now is 18:56 or 6:56 local time. Continuing on, I do have a cruising speed. So your cruising speed is going to be whatever the cruising speed is once you actually get to your cruise portion of flight, your straight and level. And you're going to notice that we've got the knots, and the knots is supposed to be an N followed by 4 digits. And then if you're flying a little faster in the Mach, then it's going to be an M followed by 3 digits. For us today, we're going to basically have this aircraft at 110. So you're going to put an N and then you have your 4 numbers, which happens to be 0110. So that's basically saying or telling the system that we anticipate a cruise speed of 110 knots. And I'll show you exactly where we come up with that number when we go back to the presentation. Your level is your altitude. With your altitude, it depends on if you're in the flight levels or if you're actually in an altitude. But very simply, what you have for most of us here is altitude in hundreds of feet. You're basically going to have the A and then whatever the value of the altitude is. So A090 is 9,000 feet. If I was in the flight levels, which is basically 18,000 and above, we would have an F and then the number behind it. So F19 or 190 is a flight level 190. In our case, I told you guys at the beginning, I'm going to go ahead and try 6,500 feet as an altitude. It's a relatively short flight. It gets me over most of the obstacles. And because I'm not using that direct line that we showed before, actually flying over the coastal region, then it'll actually be a little bit easier. Okay, or actually the altitudes will be a little bit lower. Once you find everything, go ahead and go back. And here's our level. I'm going to go A065, which is for 6,500 feet. Continuing on to the right, this is your surveillance equipment. So do you have an ADS-B or do you have a Mode C transponder here? For us, we've got a Mode C and we have an ADS-B in and out, which is a U2, Uniform 2. You can basically associate your aircraft with whatever equipment you have. Keep in mind, you can also pre-set up your aircraft as well. So once you do this and save the information for your airplane, then you don't need to do this every single time. I'm going to skip the route of flight for just a second. There's a couple things I need to fill in. So the next thing is going to be the destination, which is KPRB. The estimated time en route for me, I'm going to see if I can calculate this here real quick, is 51 minutes. Okay, so that's what this system has stated. So they're assuming based upon 110 knots of cruising speed from point to point, it would take me roughly 51 minutes of elapsed time to get there from basically wheels up to wheels down. If you wanted to put in information about an alternate airport, it's not required, but you can throw that information there. And then finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the fuel endurance. So for this airplane, the max fuel is 5 hours and 30 minutes. There's 2 individuals on board. You can put in your aircraft markings, the supplemental markings. Pilot in command is optional as well. And then the very, very bottom is a lot of the ICAO stuff. So do you have any emergency radios? Do you have a survival equipment, and what type of survival equipment? Jackets is just life jackets. Dinghies is the life rafts. That's their version of life rafts. So before I go ahead and click on the actual briefing, I'm going to go back up to where it says route of flight here. And you could actually plug in anything that you want. You could plug in airport codes. You can plug in VORs. You could plug in GPS points. I'll show you their nifty little features. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on the map button. And that's going to open up a new dialog. And I got to kind of zoom out so you guys can see this appropriately. So this is what it looks like. And it basically is a cool little free flight planning tool that you guys have access to. So right now we're in an IFR low. Obviously I'm a VFR pilot, so I'm going to make sure the VFR button is checked. And then what you guys can see is right now I'm just flying direct. And the other thing too is that there is a dash line on the right and left of my flight path. That dash line is basically all the locations where it's going to grab NOTAMs and weather. So if any airport falls within that region, it's going to capture that information and provide it to me as the pilot. Now, like I said, I had a general idea of how I wanted to fly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my little pink line here over Santa Maria. And you'll see immediately it gives me GPS waypoints. It also gives me a VOR, or I'm just going to use Santa Maria. It'll plug it in on the left-hand side here as well. And then I've got my time and fuel burn. Continuing on, I am going to plug in a waypoint for San Luis Obispo, SBP up here. And then I'm just going to assume I'll go direct to Paso Robles. Okay. So now what I've got is using this tool, you'll notice that my dashed line, my dashed pink line is slightly bent to the left there because it is following my flight path. And once you're basically happy with whatever your routing is or anything else, keep in mind you can play with this even more if you wanted to. You can also turn on the different forecasts. You could plug in TFRs, airmets, SIGMETs, severe weather. It also has radar as well. So I'm assuming if I zoom out to whoever has bad weather in this country, we'll see that as well. So somewhere out here in, was that Chicago, Midwest area, we could see that. But once you're basically satisfied with everything, then you can, basically go to the left-hand side, make sure all the numbers match up. I like my altitude at 6,500. I've got the right things in there. Once you're done, go ahead and click on the plan and brief, and however you designed your route, it's basically going to take the information from this screen and plug it back into your route of flight here. Okay. So obviously, if you didn't want to go through that, you already knew your route of flight, you could easily just plug in the values before you continue. Once everything is done, we're going to go down to the very, very bottom here, and we have a couple different options. Obviously, the cheating way is the nav log. That's what we don't want you to do. That's actually going to give you a nav log. I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. And it will give it, let's see if we can generate the full page one here. Basically, this is your digital version, right? So this is a full nav log, their version of a nav log, right? So we're going to do this by hand. What I want you guys to do is go ahead and click on Route Brief on the lower left-hand side. So we're going to click that once, and there's going to be a dialog button that's going to open. It's going to ask you what type of briefing do you want. We're going to not do anything with anything. We're not going to change anything that's currently checked, but you do have an option of standard, abbreviated, or Outlook. All we're going to do is we're going to leave it in standard, scroll down a little bit to the bottom, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on PDF briefing. You could do a web briefing, which just keeps it on your desktop. You could email it to yourself or another pilot. We're just going to click on PDF briefing. Mike, you can tell if there's bad weather. Number one, it gives you the information for the METARs for different associated airports, the color coding. And then in addition to that, it gives you, what I was pointing out was primarily the weather radar. So that was basically for precipitation. The very, very front cover of the page is going to give you everything in terms of whatever you input in the system. So we said 110 knots, 6,500 feet, departure time, date, route, all the stuff that we basically input so that way we don't forget about it. As you can see, this is 62 pages of stuff. We're not going to have time to go through it, but they have color-coded a lot of this stuff for you. So we do have the greens, which is the VFR. Remember, we talked about the NOAA weather folks, which have their own terminology for VFR, marginal IFR, and low IFR. This is where that stuff comes into play. And basically, between our departure airport and our arrival airport, we can see all of the airports and the forecast. They're all green, which is VFR. We have AirMet Sierra. And looks like we also have an AirMet Tango, so some turbulence and some IFR weather up there as well. So when you look at this stuff, it always starts off with the most significant or severe conditions. So AirMet, SIGMETs, TFRs, different types of NOTAMs like runway closures, airport closures, anything along those lines. And then it jumps into current weather, and then it jumps into forecast. Okay. So what I'll do is I will upload this to this class so you guys can look at it after the fact. I don't have time to go through the whole thing, but what we're going to do is we're going to pull out some basic information. So with the METARs, after everything that I basically showed you guys, you'll be disappointed because all the METARs in this system are decoded for you. Okay, we look at it. Departure, current conditions at Santa Ynez, California, wind 240 at 13, 10 statute miles visibility, sky is clear, temperature 15, dew point 5, altimeter 2990. Okay. Our destination, wind is 310 at 16, 10 statute miles visibility, and the list goes on. There is no codification as shown. So that's kind of the reality once you kind of leave or basically get out of the training or what we call the schoolhouse. But you are still expected to know those codes for the purpose of your written exam. So what this is these are all the METARs along the way within that 50 nautical mile distance right and left of your flight center line, whatever your flight path was. Going to grab all the current weather conditions at any reporting stations along the way, all the way to your final destination of Paso Robles. From there, it does give you your cloud forecast and so forth, but we're going to skip all that for right now. I want to go down to the TAFs here. So this is your TAF section. It was a little bit cut off. This is your forecast. So with the forecast, it's going to, these green dots are representing the approximate time that you're going to be within each forecasted period. And what it's going to tell you is it's going to tell you, instead of just giving all of these different TAFs, which are also decoded, it's going to tell you, is the TAF VFR, IFR, marginal, or low IFR when based upon the information. Also, it's going to give you the approximate time, assuming that everything checks out, our aircraft speed that we entered, and also our departure time matched up. It would tell us that we would basically be getting or passing at 156 Santa Barbara. We would be at 216 Zulu. We should be looking at this specific TAF. If it was in between TAF periods, it does tell you as a hint to reference it. So this is telling you 17 minutes earlier, you could actually look at this TAF. As you can see here, this is for Vandenberg, which is off the coast. And this is actually pretty gusty, right? 25 knots gusting to 35 and some occasional moderate turbulence and clear air from surface to 6,000 feet. Anyways, you can basically follow that along through all those reporting stations until you get to your final destination. And luckily for us, it will pull it out, the exact TAF period that we care about, assuming everything matches up. Once again, still windy, 320 at 18, gusting to 28, 6 statute miles, and sky clear up there. Okay. Most of the other stuff in this packet is going to be a lot of NOTAMs towards the end. Almost 30 pages of this is going to be NOTAMs. We also have our winds aloft section. So this is where it's going to tell us the 6,500. In case you forgot the codification, it's up here in the upper right-hand corner, heading, speed, and temperature. And then we have our 3 forecasted periods. So for this first chart here is from 20 to 0300 Zulu. The second chart is from 0300 to 1200. And then we've got a third one here from 1200 to basically 000 Zulu. So because we're anticipating taking off now, we have a few different variations. We could use Santa Barbara. We could use Foxfield, which is out in the desert. That's the wrong direction. And Fresno, California, is a little bit too far to the north and too far inland. So what we're going to use for our winds aloft is going to be the Santa Barbara reporting station. And we're going to stick with the 6,500. So what we've got is 325 at 19 and plus 14 degrees Celsius. We can also see what would end up happening if I went to a higher altitude. Today, it probably wouldn't be any better. It would take me longer because instead of 19 knots, it's 24 knots at 8,500, or at even 10,500, it goes up to 29 knots. Now, if I was flipping this flight around and I was basically departing up here from Paso Robles going back to Santa Ynez, then a higher altitude would be in my favor because it would be considered a tailwind instead of a headwind the entire way. So you can kind of figure out what is the most comfortable for you. You might also want to go up higher just because there was some moderate turbulence at 6,000. So you could try 8.5, you could try 10.5. Just remember, it's got to align with the appropriate VFR altitudes when we're flying it. Okay. So now that you basically look at the weather packet, and I apologize, we're going to have to kind of normally go through this in a bit more depth, but I need to get to the other sections here. You guys can take a look at this later. Once you basically get to that portion of it, then what you're going to do is you will come back, and what we're looking for is we want to pull specific information out of that weather packet that we're going to need for the purposes of computing the next step here. Okay. So as I said before, the weather packet that I just pulled is going to be different than the one that we use in this presentation. The information in this presentation was pulled from last summer, and it's not going to perfectly match. But we're going to go with the same numbers that you guys see on the screen here. So first things first is we are basically going to look at our winds aloft chart, and the numbers and values that I would write down out of this, out of 6,500, is my selected altitude. My wind direction is that's 006. That's what it should be. So this is actually 006. I think in the presentation I screwed it up, so we're going to go with 060. Imagine that that's slightly different there. And then the velocity is 26 knots, okay? The temperature is 13, so that's going to be the first set of numbers that I'm actually going to write down. The next thing that I want to write down from the weather packet is going to be the current conditions, and then also take a look at the forecasted conditions. The reason why I need the temperature for the departure airport, so this is Santa Ynez. These are the METARs for Santa Ynez and Paso Robles. So this would be the current weather that I pulled the report for. So fairly warm, 27 degrees Celsius at Santa Ynez and 24 degrees Celsius at Paso Robles. I need temperature values in order to compute our takeoff and landing distance, and also to figure out what is the standard temperature, okay? The other thing that I also need to know is for Paso Robles, I'm going to look at the TAF, basically our forecast, and figure out where are we going to line up with in terms of if we do everything right, what time should we land, and which forecast period am I looking at. So starting off with the METAR for Santa Ynez, overall a nice day. Wind is 280 to 11, a little bit gusty to 17. 10 statute miles visibility, skies are clear, kind of warm, but that's about it. The current conditions for Paso Robles, the same. We've got wind of 330 at 6, 10 statute miles, and clear skies. Also a warm day at 24 degrees. And what you'll notice is that obviously it is not as windy up in Paso Robles as it is in Santa Maria. Now, if I look at the TAF, this is what I've highlighted right here. This is what the system is telling us that this is the TAF we want to reference because it basically covers the approximate time that we would have been landing. So this is telling us wind is 330 at 8 knots and greater than 6 statute miles. Now, the other thing is that you always want to look before and beyond whatever the anticipated point or time of landing is, just to see how the conditions are maybe will be different. So, for example, if I landed a little bit later, we could see that the wind actually picks up. It's going to be 320 at 15 knots. But once again, clear skies, good visibility. And even later, in the early morning, 1 a.m., we've got wind of 330 at 8 knots and 6 statute miles. So it looks like just for this small period of time at 1900 local time, the wind will increase, but eventually it will decrease as well. It's nothing too significant from point to point. Okay. Now that I've got some basic information written down, I haven't done anything with my chart yet. I haven't done anything with the navigation log. We'll get to that here in a minute. What I like to do at this point is basically figure out what is our top of climb and what is our top of descent. And you'll see the reason why once we do it. So is everyone good so far? Making sure you're all alive out there? All right, so with your top of climb, basically what we want to do is from our departure point. So in our case, our departure point is going to be Santa Ynez, K-I-Z-A. And we know that we want to basically fly at 6,500 feet. The question is how much time is it going to take us to get to this point, which is called our top of climb? How much fuel are we going to burn, and what is the distance? And the distance is important because that helps us plot a point on our sectional to kind of figure out roughly when would we actually get to that point from our departure, okay? Now, what you have is you're going to use your time, fuel, and distance to climb. I purposely use Cessna charts because they're a little bit faster and easier here. And what we've got is this specific airport is obviously we have to interpolate a little bit the information because it's not at sea level and it's definitely not at 1,000 feet. So there's a two-step process here. And the first step that we're looking at is in red. And then once we do this, we'll take a break here. The first step is that we know that we're trying to get to 6,500 feet. So what we're going to do is we are basically going to go down to our chart here. And we're going to read the information. And of course, there isn't 6,500. So we've got 6,000 and 7,000. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to average these numbers. So here I have 10 minutes. It would take me 10 minutes to get to 6,000 and 13 minutes for 7. I would consume 2.1 gallons for 6 and 2.5 gallons for 7,000. And then there's my distance, 14 and 17. So very simply, each one of those I'm going to add together and then divide by 2, and that will give me my average, or approximately the values that I need for 6,500 feet. So what that gives me is it gives me 11 and a half minutes, 2.3 gallons of gas, and 15.5 nautical miles. And that is assuming I am taking off from sea level and going up to 6,500 feet. Okay. This is if you guys are operating in an airport where you are always at sea level, like here at Camarillo, it's actually very easy. If you're operating at an airport that is higher than sea level, then you're going to have to do 2 separate steps. Okay. That's step number 1. And the other component that I'm also going to write down is my climb speed. Okay. The climb speed is between 73 and 74. I am going to use a more conservative number. You always want to go more conservative or slower in this case. So I'm going to choose 73 knots indicated. That's basically your knots indicated airspeed. That's step number 1. Step number 2 is because the field elevation at this airport is 674 feet. So this airport has an elevation of 674 feet. What we just calculated was basically sea level. So what we're saying is those values work from going from sea level up to 6,500. Okay. Yes, it's only a couple hundred feet, but it does matter. So in this case, because it's 674 feet, I'm not going to go crazy with the numbers. I'm just going to take the average between sea level and 1,000 feet, just for simplicity's sake here. And what I have is I'm going to look at the time. So it's between 0 and 1. So that's 30 seconds. The fuel, 0 and 0.4. So that's 0.02. And the distance, 0 and 2, is basically half of that is 1. Okay. So this gives me in my next set of values, meaning that it's a half a minute, 0.2 gallons, and 1 nautical mile. Okay. And the reason why we're doing that, once again, is that we are not taking off from sea level. We're actually taking off a little bit higher, about 674 feet above sea level. Now what we're going to do is what we did in step number 1 here. In step number 2, we want to subtract the difference of those numbers. Okay. So very simply, I'm going to take the time of 11.1 minutes, and then I'm going to subtract the 30 seconds, or the half a minute, and that is going to give me a final value of 11 minutes. The fuel, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to take the 2.3 gallons I calculated in step 1, subtract 0.2, and then I have to do an extra step here that you guys will notice, is that I want to include 1.1 gallons for engine start, taxi, and takeoff allowance. Within the note section right here, it's actually note number 1 that says add 1.1 gallons for fuel for engine start, taxi, and takeoff allowance. Remember, that's your baseline number. If you guys are operating at busier airports, you could basically adjust that to, or basically increase that value. So with that, I'm going to add the 1.1 to that, my final number, and that's going to tell me I'm going to basically use 3.2 gallons. With distance, I'm going to take my distance that I found in the first value, 15.5. I'm going to subtract 1 nautical mile. That's going to give me 14.5 nautical miles. So at this point, what this is telling me is to get from the airport elevation of 674 feet to 6,500 feet, it's going to take me approximately 11 minutes. I'm going to burn 3.2 gallons, and I'm basically going to cover a distance of 14.5 nautical miles until I reach my top of climb. Okay. It is assuming everything is standard, and there are some other computations in here. So if you guys read the notes here, I don't want to complicate it too much, but there's always going to be adjustments. So note number 2 is basically assuming we lean the mixture at 3,000. Note 3, you're going to increase your time, fuel, and distance by 10% for each 10 degrees Celsius above standard. We're not going to do that for simplicity's sake. And then number 4, distances are based off of 0 wind. Okay. You'd be amazed if you guys climb up enough. Some of these airplanes, they take like 40, 50 miles to get to 10,000 feet, especially like the ones that don't perform very well. Okay. So now what we've got is just to kind of recap, we've looked at our weather. We made sure we can actually go. We've written down the information we need from our weather, our temperature numbers. We've also basically written down or have a general sense of our routing. We also have figured out our altitude that we want to fly. We've written down our winds aloft. We've also looked at the forecast, and now what we have is our top of climb values. So we know that it's going to take us 11 minutes, 3.2 gallons, and 14.5 nautical miles to get from our departure elevation airport, which is at 674 feet, up to 6,500 feet, which is our top of climb. What we'll do is we'll take a quick 5-minute break. When we come back, we're going to look at our top of descent, and then we actually have enough information to start plugging it into the flight planning format. Okay. With that, I'll see everybody back in 5. welcome back. Sorry, I was just trying to drop that link in there for you. So if anybody actually wants the PDF copy from the FAA, they are pretty large files. If you actually want to try to print it out, you can do so. The FAA does provide TIFF and also PDFs of all of the current sectional charts, so you can always do it that way as well. All right, so now that we have a top of climb, and top of climb is not a new thing. I saw someone ask that in the future. It's just, when you're doing this stuff, it is easy to be kind of lazy about it and not calculate some of these values. That's really what it kind of comes down to, usually what we see. But even if you look at like the ForeFlight version, right? So here's the ForeFlight one again. They've got a top of climb and they've got a top of descent as well. Okay, same stuff that we use in the airlines. When are we expected to get to our cruising altitude, and when are we actually supposed to start a descent based off of that? So the top of descent is the exact same thing. It's just going to be a matter of we're flying at 6,000 feet, and when are we going to actually want to start descending? Now, the Piper aircraft and Diamonds, and I think Cirrus have them as well, they have top of descent charts. The Cessna 172 Romeo that we're looking at does not actually have a TOD chart. So there are two different ways that we can basically calculate this. The first way is probably the fastest, quickest way to do it, and we use this in the airlines pretty much on a daily basis. It's called the 3-to-1 rule, and it's the 3-to-1 rule of descent. What that means is it's based off of a 3-degree glide slope, which is basically a standard glide slope on most instrument approaches. That for every 3 nautical miles of distance that we travel, we're basically dropping 1,000 feet. Okay, so very simply, you try to figure out what altitude we're at, and then what altitude we want to be at by the time we get to the airport. Now, for our purposes, we are at 6,500 feet. If we look at this note right here, and our traffic pattern altitude, because I'm not going straight down to the airport, I need to get into the traffic pattern. Okay, so the traffic pattern altitude is 1,900 feet. For simplicity of math, I'm just going to round that up to 2,000. But all you do is you figure out the altitude you're at and the one that you're going to be going to. I'll do 1,900 so I can actually give you guys the right example. And just figure out what is the altitude that you need to lose. Okay, so in this example, we basically need to lose a total of 4,600 feet. So in order to get from our cruise, which is here, to our traffic pattern altitude at Paso Robles, we need to lose 4,600 feet. Using the 3-to-1 rule, all we do is you take the altitude. In this case, we take 4,600 and we just take 4.6 and multiply it by 3. We drop the 2 zeros there. So 4.6 and multiply that by 3, it is about 13.8 nautical miles that we would start a descent based upon the 3-to-1 rule. Like I said, in the airlines, we do it all the time. So for example, if we're flying at 36,000 feet, okay, so that's basically flight level 360. And our goal is we want to get down to not even flight level, but your altitude of 10,000 feet. That means that I need to basically descend 26,000 feet, okay? When I look at these values, I would multiply the 26 by 3. And that would tell me roughly when would I need to start descending, which would be 78 nautical miles. Okay, so that's just a couple examples for the 3-to-1 rule. You can use that, or you can just base it off of feet per minute. So a couple known values, especially when we're in descent. If we're going to descend at 120 knots, then we would be covering about 2 nautical miles a minute. Okay, and what you'd want to do is you want to figure out what is roughly a good descent rate. Most descents, even in instrument world, is going to be between 500 to 1,000 feet per minute. 500 is actually pretty good, so we're going to stick with 500 feet per minute. So based upon the amount of altitude that we need to lose, roughly about, and I rounded it to 4,500 feet in this example, just so we could do a simpler calculation. At 500 feet per minute, how many minutes is it going to take us to lose that altitude, right? So if I do 4,500 divided by 5, that means it's going to take me approximately 9 minutes in order to descend. Now, based upon our speed, okay, we're covering 2 nautical miles a minute. What we do is we multiply the 2 by the 9, okay? 2 times 9 is going to tell us that we need to be about 18 miles away for you to actually descend at 500 feet per minute, assuming you're going at 120 knots. If you're going faster, then that distance is going to be even further away from the airport. If you're going slower, then that distance is going to be closer to the airport. Okay. So you can use ballpark numbers like this to basically best guess in terms of how you're actually going to descend. Now, the problem with some of these numbers is we all have the best intentions and we all want to get at 500 feet. We all want to descend at 500 feet per minute. Most of my students choose this method. The problem is that we're always, they love looking out the window and seeing what's around them. And as we start to approach the 18-mile mark in this example, they start a descent. Everything looks great. They pull the power back. They're at 500 feet per minute. And then they start looking outside and looking at all the cool views. And then magically we start to shallow out. That 500 turns into 400, which turns into 300. And now we're getting closer and closer to the airport. And the next thing you know is we're 6 miles away from the airport. We're still a couple thousand feet high and they're trying to dive bomb it because they kind of fell behind. So if you choose a method like this, like the 500 feet per minute, just try to always kind of glance at that, glance at it and make sure that you're actually doing 500 feet per minute in order to do it. Okay. All right, so now that we have some basic information, we've got a TOD, a TOC, we have our weather information. Now what it is you can basically calculate and start putting the information on paper. So first step is to basically take all your waypoints that you want it to have, and you can put in your airport codes. If you're going to be doing VORs, you can plug those in, or if it's a GPS waypoint, you can also plug that in. So in this circumstance, I'll refresh your memory. Try to do at least 2 out of the 3 of the following. So pilotage, dead reckoning, or radio navigation. And the waypoint should be about 25 to 35 nautical miles away if it is allowable or feasible. So the reason why I like to do TOC or TOD is half the time, like I said, everybody starts plugging in the waypoints. They forget the TOC or TOD, and then we ask them about TOC. They throw their piece of paper away. They magically get TOC in there, and then they start filling out, they start filling out pretty much everything. And then the question is where is your TOD? They throw out the second piece of paper. They start over. Now magically we have our route, our top of climb, our top of descent. Now things are starting to look a little bit better. Don't always assume that your top of climb is your second point. If you are climbing up to a higher altitude, your top of climb may fall somewhere in between a waypoint further down. So just keep that in mind. Don't necessarily always assume it's your second waypoint, or the top of descent is your second to last waypoint before getting to your airport. Okay. What you're going to do is you're always going to start off with whatever the departure point is. In this case, it's the KIZA airport. We have our top of climb. I'll show you, based upon the distance that we came up with earlier, that basically falls over the city of Los Alamos, California. So that's going to be one of our checkpoints. We've got Santa Maria Airport, San Luis Obispo Airport, our top of descent, which actually doesn't really fall anywhere unique. It's just going to be a certain distance away from the airport. And then we have our final destination of Paso Robles. Okay. Now that we have our checkpoints written down, we can also start pre-populating the information that we learned a little bit earlier. So here's our TOC information, here's our TOD information, and also our winds aloft as well at the very bottom. So first thing is we could plug in the altitude. So typically you're going to plug in whatever altitude you have. Usually what I have students do is I have them put an up arrow when they're climbing. So it's usually going to be up until they reach top of climb. And then once it's at 6.5, then that's assuming that it's level. And then we'll reverse that after they basically approach the top of descent to indicate that they are in a descent. Your wind direction. So basically we have our direction, our velocity, and our temperature, like a Mickey Mouse there. That is pulled from your weather packet. So in this case, like I said, it didn't match. I wrote down the wrong numbers, but it's 060 is the wind direction. Then we have our velocity of 26 knots, and then we have our temperature of plus 13 degrees Celsius. Now, some instructors, you can do this if you want. Some instructors will actually use the local numbers or basically lower numbers because these values are based off of 6,500. And you might have winds aloft that are different lower. When you look at the digital platforms out there like these, ForeFlight does a better job, and the problem is you have to have realistic expectations here. you will not be able to calculate the exact same values as ForeFlight does, because what it does is it takes blended numbers. So from the airport to your top of climb, they're actually looking at all of the different winds that are going on every couple thousand feet. If we attempted to do that in something like this, it would take us, hours longer than it needs to be. Okay. So a lot of us, like I said, you have two different options. You can use a lower value, or you can try to simplify it and just use a single value for whatever altitude you intend on flying at. If you're flying a longer distance, then obviously you might have different stations as well. For us, it's all going to be out of Santa Barbara, but let's assume I was flying up to San Francisco. I might use my winds aloft from Santa Barbara for the first half. Then I might use the San Francisco winds aloft for the second half of the flight if it was something longer. Okay. The other pieces of information that we can throw in here is this is our true airspeed. And we've come up with the value of 73 knots based upon our top of climb chart. So that is the value that we're going to plug in there. We also know that it's going to take us 14.5 nautical miles to get to 6,500 feet. And they already give us a couple of the calculations. Our estimated time en route, meaning how long is it going to take us? 11 minutes. And we are going to burn roughly 3.2 gallons of fuel. Okay. So now that we have some basic information, we also have our top of descent, which depending on which method you use, I kind of rounded up and gave us a little bit of a buffer. So I said 14 nautical miles from the 3-to-1 rule, just because I know the student's going to shallow out from that. So I have basically put a point 14 nautical miles south of the airport on our way there. So from this point, what we're going to do is we're going to actually go and measure the true course. And with this is where you're going to go ahead and take out your charts if you have them, or just, like I said, follow along. And we'll basically show you how to measure each one of the legs' true course. And what we're going to do is we are basically going to compute a true course in this column. While we're computing a true course, we are also going to grab the distance. This is something that students forget. A lot of times we are so excited to just do the first column that we realize that at the same time we can knock out two birds with one stone, and we can also grab the distances as well. So the distances for these other three can be computed, and then from there we'll take the next steps. All right, so let's go ahead and do this step by step. This is where, if you pull out your maps, and I'm going to go to the other page real quick here. All right, so when I'm looking at this, and I'm going to keep that slide up just so we can kind of have it in the background here. So as I am looking at this information, there's a couple of things that I'm doing. So obviously you'll notice that my route has changed. Instead of having that straight line going up, I'm basically going from airport to airport to airport. And I just drew it in red, so that way it's a bit easier for you to actually visualize and see as we are doing this. Now, I've also happened to put on my top of climb, and I've also put in my top of descent here, so I kind of know where I am on the map. So theoretically, if all the numbers hold true, I take off from Santa Ynez and I will reach 6,500 feet at this point. I'm going to basically be flying straight and level all the way through. And then by the time I reach my top of descent, that is when I'm going to be starting to descend for the specific airport. Okay. So what I do here is I am actually trying to figure out two pieces of information. The easiest one I'm going to show you is obviously going to be distance. So when you look at your device, and it doesn't matter if it's rotating or not, we're not going to use that part here. What you're going to notice is pay attention to the information along the scale. So this might be difficult for you to see, but right here, that says sectional, okay? Some of these are designed for sectional charts. Some are designed for the WAC chart, which is the World Aeronautical Chart. So the numbers at the bottom are designed for the WAC charts. The numbers at the top are designed for the sectional charts. And just make sure that you're looking at the correct scale. So when I measure the information and I look at it, let's see what we've got here. What I'm going to do is you basically line it up so you can see my top of climb and my airport. Just put it over the center of the airport. And what I can see here is each tick, just like a ruler, is going to effectively be basically 1 nautical mile. So there's 10 nautical miles there. There's 20, and I'm sorry, that's actually 5, 10, and 15. See, I already looked at the wax scale. The wax scale is this one at the top. The sectional is the one at the bottom. So that's 5, 10, and 15. And remember, looking at the screen on the right-hand side, we said that our top of climb is roughly going to be about 14.5 nautical miles. So that's the reason why I basically drew a line here and put TOC for my top of climb. So when I'm doing this, one of the steps that I'm going to do or use is figure out what is the difference from point to point to point, and just make sure that you're looking at the correct scale. I just made a good example of why you want to do that. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to also talk about measuring our true course. So with a true course, I will show you two different methods here. Actually, one method, but I'll kind of explain what the true course is. So remember that we have the North Pole and the South Pole, the very, very top of the Earth and the very bottom of the Earth. And what we're going to do is we are actually going to measure the true course, which is going to be slightly different than our magnetic direction. Okay, so we're going to show you how to actually measure the true course. And then from that point, we're going to then make some corrections to it based upon wind conditions and also where you're located on Earth in terms of variation, in order to come up with a compass heading. So the true course is the angle your flight path makes with the true North Pole. Okay, so as you can see here in this example, our true course, depending on which way we're flying, if we're going from Table Rock to Martin Airport, we have a true course of 060. If we are going vice versa, then it will be 240. So the way that you do this is you'd want to obviously map this out. And the reason why I drew it in red is it's a little bit easier to see. And what you're going to do is you want to line up your ruler, the very top part of your ruler, and ensure that it matches the line. And what we're going to do is we are going to find a line of longitude. So longitude is the lines that go basically up and down, right? So what I'm going to do from that point is I'm going to see where it intersects. Okay. So I'm going to show you how to do this in real time rather than looking at the graphic. But there was one graphic I do want to show you in terms of measuring. When you're measuring, like I said, for those that weren't able to see it, pay attention. So like I said before, I accidentally looked at the wax scale when I was doing this. So you could see 10, 20, and 30. But in reality, 5, 10, and 15 is right there. Okay. So make sure that you're on the correct side. You are using nautical miles, not statute miles. And you have everything set up correctly, because one side is statute miles if you're flying an aircraft that's maybe doing miles per hour. The other side is nautical miles, which is going to be matching up to knots, which is what we're looking for. Okay. So when you're measuring the distances, you're also going to be for most efficient purposes, measure the distance and also figure out what the true course is. Okay. So let's go back to the slide here, and I'm going to show you how to actually do this. All right, so if we look at it from point to point, what you want to do is very simply take the straight edge. Okay, and with the straight edge right here, I'm basically just trying to line this up with it. But what I want to do, my goal is that there's a grommet. So the grommet is the metal part in the center here. That is what I want to put on a line of longitude. So that's one of the lines that goes up and down. Now what you're going to be able to see is that there is a line of longitude here, and I also have one here, but it's not perfectly on the map. So what I'm going to do is I have two different options. I think the easiest option is going to be doing something like this. And remember that I can extend this ruler down to find a line of longitude, or I can extend it up to find a line of longitude, either way. And I'm just going to choose to extend it down a little bit. Okay. So when I do that, I've got a line of longitude right underneath the map that's basically going perfectly vertical, north and south here. And I'm going to put my grommet over it. And the other thing you're going to notice is that I've got my red line that's lined up with the edge of it. So what I'm going to do, and this is the reason why these are a bit easier, is this thing spins in all directions. And my goal is to get these arrows to basically point north and follow that line of longitude perfectly to make sure that it actually matches. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust this just a little bit here and you'll notice that my idea is to get 0 on this line of longitude here. And what you do is you read the direction of flight. So if I'm going this way, what you're going to do is you're going to read whatever that number is. So here is 310 and here is 320. So that's roughly about 315. So my true course, if I took off from this airport and was going this way, would be about 315. If I was going the opposite direction, I would read in this corner down here and figure out what that number happens to be as well. Okay. And it's that simple. And what we're going to do is we're going to basically do this from line to line. Now, anytime, if this is a true straight line, so for example, Santa Ynez to Santa Maria is a straight line. I didn't put a bend in it. I just put the top of climb right there. So the true course is going to actually remain the same. Anytime that there's a change of direction, you're going to have a new true course. So for example, from these two airports right here, what is the true course? So all I'm going to do is, once again, this is a harder one to do. So I am going to adjust it where I'm going to put the grommet over one of the lines of longitude, however I can do it. So right about there, I've got my red line right underneath. That's basically paralleling the ruler. And I'm basically going to move these arrows until one of these lines matches up perfectly with the line of longitude. Once again, I read whatever the direction is moving this way because I'm flying this way. If I was flying south, I would read the direction going the opposite direction. So in this case, if I look at this and everything is lined up, I have roughly about here's 330, here's 340. So I've got about roughly about 335, assuming I don't move it too far. Okay. And while you're doing this, a lot of students will figure out the true course. And then what will end up happening is they write all those down and then they go back and they completely forget about the distance. Make sure you're filling in both. So what you would do at this point, right? So if the first one, like I said, was going to be roughly about 314 or 315, what I would do is, this is where I would put it in. I would put in 314 and 314 here. Okay. Now I know that basically between this point and Santa Maria, it is a straight line, because what we're saying is from here to top of climb to the airport, there is no change. So guess what? Makes it really easy. 314, 314. Just remember, also figure out what the distance is. Wrong one there. Distance is right here. And also add that in. And what you're going to do is you're going to do that for every single leg. So that is that one. The other one that students usually like me to do as well is going to be using the old-fashioned one. Not a big deal. You're going to notice that there's two scales in this one. So there is actually an inner scale right here, and then you have the outer scale as well. So the outer scale is effectively using a line of longitude, and the inner scale is using a line of latitude. So very simple. So once again, all you're going to do is line this sucker up. The grommet in this case is not metal. It's just a little dot or a hole right kind of in the center here. And what you want to do is, once again, find a line of longitude. And I'll show you this one first. So right here, my grommet is under this line of longitude, and it's a little bit hard to see, but if you follow the pen, that is the line. And then I'm perfectly perpendicular on my red line there. And what you do is you read whatever it says right there, whatever it basically intersects. So there's a very small line of longitude, and it's intersecting one of these tick marks. So you'll notice that the tick marks say 150 and 330, right? I'm going to go to the one to the right just because it's a little bit easier to see. And you do have to know which general direction you're going. Remember, 150 is heading south, 330 is heading north. So that is one important distinction. So if I look at this, I know that I'm heading north. So here's 330, and let's see if I can get a little bit better there. So what I've got here in my example is you're basically going to figure out where it's going to intersect. Okay. Now, the other way of doing this as well is you can find a line of latitude, which is basically the lines going from left to right. Do the exact same thing. So if I line this up and figure that out, I will do this and put it right over the line. what I want you to do is take a look right in here this time, and we're going to see where that line of latitude effectively will come across, and it looks like it's roughly the same place. So this is where we use the inner scale versus the outer scale. Inner scale is going to be using the lines that go left and right, or basically are your lines of latitude. Lines of longitude, we use the bigger one, which is more common. Remember that if it's hard, if you're having a hard time finding a line of latitude or longitude, you can effectively extend that ruler in either direction, because no matter what, it's going to match the actual line that we're trying to line up with. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? All right, everybody good to go? So Kelsey, we will talk about the next step here once we have our actual true course moving forward. Okay. So now that we actually have our true course, what we would do now is, after we take all of the measurements, we should have something that effectively looks like this. Okay. So what you're going to notice. So now that we actually have something that looks just like this, what we've got is, you'll notice that the course, I've kind of cheated a little bit, but your course numbers will be here, right? We've got 314, 314, 336, 002, and 002. These values right here will actually end up in the first column. So that's basically how I'm transferring it over, which is going to be considered your TC, which is going to be your true course. Now what we need to do is we need to figure out what is our true airspeed values once we're actually in cruise. We know that we're going to be at 73 knots indicated when we're in a climb. Now what we need to do is we need to go back to our performance charts, and in this we're going to use that cruise performance table. So our selected altitude is 6,500, and this Cessna, of course, does not have 6,500. We've got 4, 6, and 8,000 values in terms of pressure altitude. So the closest one that we are going to be able to look at is going to be the 6,000 foot range that you guys see right here. And the next question is, are we going to use the standard temperature, the 20 degrees above standard temperature to the right, or 20 degrees below standard temperature, right? So if we remember going back, our standard lapse rate is 2 degrees every 1,000 feet. So every 1,000 feet that we climb, it should theoretically get 2 degrees colder. And we have a standard temperature at sea level of 15 degrees Celsius. So very simply, we have an expectation that at 6,500, it should be roughly 0 degrees Celsius, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to compare that with what the winds aloft temperature is actually telling us. And it's telling us that it's at plus 13 degrees Celsius. So in this case, it's not standard temperature. It's actually going to be above standard temperature, okay? Now you could interpolate the differences between standard and 20 degrees Celsius above standard. For our purposes today, because we're running out a little bit of time, there's only just a couple of differences between these values. The airspeed is a little bit slower with the hotter temperature, and mainly what I'm paying attention to is right here in this box. This is our true airspeed of 116. And then our fuel burn is right there, which is 8.1 gallons per hour. Now, this also comes down to your power setting, which is on the right-hand side. So your lowest power setting that you can use is 2,000 RPMs. And obviously that will drop your speed and also drop your fuel burn. But you can also choose something on the higher end like 2350, which is basically max power at this altitude. For most of us, we're probably going to be at max power unless there's some reason why we're saving fuel. Remember that the flight schools are billing you by the hour. They don't care how much fuel you save them. So most of us just want to get there as quickly as possible. So usually it's all or nothing in these cases. So what we're going to write down from this information is our cruise performance settings. So we've got 2,300 RPMs as a selection. We're going to go 116 knots, which is going to be our true airspeed. And then we are going to burn 8.1 gallons of fuel. So the next step is to take that information and basically translate it back onto the chart here. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take my true airspeed in the cruise. So here I've got 116, 116, and I'm going to keep that in the descent as well. Some aircraft like the Piper, in their top of descent chart, they'll tell you exactly what speed you should be descending at. Most Pipers around like 120-ish. And then the next thing that I can also populate before I forget the answer is the 8.1 gallons. That's what actually goes in the upper right-hand box, just as a reminder when we do the calculations in a little bit, okay? The next step that we're going to basically do is we're going to use the E6B and we're going to calculate the center section there, which is going to be our wind correction angle, which are these boxes, okay? And when we calculate the wind correction angle and we go through the process, it will give us both the wind correction angle and it will give us the estimated ground speed. So we're actually going to be able to populate two different numbers using the same, basically using the same system here. And the reason why we calculate a wind correction angle is very simply, it's going to be based upon our ground track, and we're basically compensating for drift. I think I've used this example before. If I am trying to get, or in a simplified example, if I'm basically trying to swim from position A to position B, if I'm out in the ocean or a lake, you know, I can't necessarily swim in a straight line, because if I swim in a straight line, you're going to start to actually end up drifting to a new position. So what you have to do is you have to compensate. And in this case, the swimmer is basically crabbed into the current or swimming slightly against the current. And the nose, or if you're going to translate this into an airplane, the nose of the airplane would be slightly turned into the wind or the current in order to maintain a specific ground track, right? So instead of using a human being, if we were to basically put this into airplane terms here, we always have the desired ground track, but just because the desired ground track might be 090 degrees, if the wind is strong enough, even a couple knots, then 090, it's going to start to blow me off course, right? So my goal might be to maintain a 090, but the reality is that I have to point my nose maybe to something like 060 degrees. And 060 degrees is going to allow me to maintain my ground track of 090. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And that's basically what we are calculating. We're calculating how much do we need to compensate for the wind based upon the direction of travel. And in some circumstances, it may be nothing. If it's wind calm, then your value would just be whatever your true course is. If it is pretty windy, you might need to compensate 15, 20, or 30 degrees, depending on the day. So this next step of what we're going to do is we're going to look at the wind correction angle. And with this, you're going to look on this side of your E6B. So you can always follow along with the UND one, or there's the prepware one online as well. I think someone threw up there, whatever other options you have. And the nice thing about the E6B is it always gives you the instructions at the very, very top. So the thing that we want to do, and we'll do this step by step. Couple things I'll point out is that we are always going to reference basically this little upside down triangle here called the true index. And then this portion is actually movable right and left, clockwise and counterclockwise. And then I'm also going to be talking about the grommet. The grommet is the center portion right here. And it is some of them are actually like a metal grommet, and some are, you know, just kind of a little clear hole that basically has, you know, it's just a clear hole. At the very top of your E6B, it always gives you the instructions. The instructions are always printed in every single, you know, on every single device. And you just basically want to follow it step by step in the correct order. Now, step number one is always place the grommet over 100. It's not a requirement, but almost everybody follows this practice because it is easier to count up from 100 than it is to, you know, choose a different number. And I'll show you why here in a second. Let me open up the E6B simulator here. So if you're following along on this site, this is the slide ruler, the flight computer side. That's not the side we want. We want the wind side. Looks exactly like this. At the very top, you guys can see that here are all of your instructions, and then there is a movable card here. So basically, if I look at this thing as a whole, this device will actually move up and down depending on what I want it to do. And the main thing that I'm looking for is it has really two different functions. It has a slide function, and then it has the rotation portion that allows me to rotate the true index. So here's the grommet in the dead center. Currently it's over 140. So what I want to do is I actually want to bring that down so the grommet is over 100. So right there, the grommet is over 100, and I'll zoom in so you guys can see that a little bit better. So there's my grommet. It's perfectly over 100. Now what I want to do is I want to basically pay attention to the true index here at the very top. So hopefully you guys have all of your numbers that I just had up on the screen there. If not, I will go through them one by one. So we're going to do probably about 2 or 3 of these, and then we'll have to move on to the next one. So like I said, come back to the video if you need help. And we actually posted an E6B video where I go through 15 different problems using both sides of the E6B. And you guys, there's a worksheet that you can follow along with as well to basically gain some practice. So the first thing that it says in the instructions for all of you, it should say place wind direction under the true index. Place your wind direction under the true index. So your wind direction in this case is going to be based upon your winds aloft. And the winds aloft that I gave you is going to be 060. So the first thing that I want to do here is I want to go ahead and basically move this device, so this portion, until I get 060 at the top underneath the true index. Okay, so there is 060. That's lined up as close as I can get it to the true index. Then step number 2 states mark wind velocity up from center. Okay, so what you're going to do is, if you have the actual device right now, what you're going to do is we've used 100 as kind of like a baseline. And our wind velocity as per our winds aloft chart was 26. The reason why we use 100 is it's easier to count 26 units up from 100 than, placing it on like 87 and counting 26 up from that point. So very simply, all you're going to do is place a mark, and usually we do this by pencil. Here is 120, okay? Here is 125, and there is roughly 126. That's my little dot there, okay? Probably a little bit lower than that. That's about 126. So that's the first step. So I'm using my winds aloft. I've got 060 and 26 knots, so I'm going 26 up from 100. Step number 3, place the true course under the true index. So the first thing that we want to look at, we're going to skip the first line. The reason why we're skipping the first line is we already have the time, fuel, and distance because we got that from the manual, okay? The second line is actually the same true course. It's 314 degrees. That's what we've computed using our plotter. So very simply, I am going to go ahead and spin this device and figure out where is 314. So there's 315 and there is 314. The next thing that it says is and you'll notice without doing anything, my red dot here is now slightly to the right and behind my 100 mark. You could think of the grommet or this little thing right here as where the airplane is. So here you could basically visualize that the wind is kind of a quartering tailwind from the right-hand side. The next step that we need to do is going to be to slide the wind velocity mark to your true airspeed. Okay. Slide the wind velocity mark to the true airspeed. Now we've computed a true airspeed of 116 knots in cruise. So all I'm going to do here is basically, this is where we're going to move this thing up and down. I'm going to scroll out just a little bit so I can do so. And when we look at this, right, we can basically move this device up or down. Okay. It acts just like a slide rule. So step back real quick. I forgot the only problem with this system that I don't like is it can be challenging to manipulate sometimes. All right, so let me put that back at 314. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the movable card behind it, and you're basically going to slide it up and down. See if I can get this again here. Okay, there we go. All right, so what I want to do is where the grommet is right now, I don't want to actually do what I just did. I'm basically going to take the grommet. Let me do this one more time really quickly. If you guys want to follow along, I basically set this at 100. I have the first one, which is going to be 060. So I'm just putting in the wind right now. So there's 060 up to 1, basically 26. So I'll populate that dot. Then I'm going to spin this to my course, which is 314. And hopefully we'll be back on track here. So here is 314. Now what I'm going to do is I want that red dot over whatever my true airspeed is. So what I want to do is I want to put that over 116. So there is 115 and 116 is slightly above that line right there. You guys can see that. That's roughly my red dot is right around 116. So from this point, this is going to give me a couple pieces of information. The first one that I can write down is wherever the grommet is. In this case, it happens to be over 120. That is my estimated ground speed. Okay, that is my estimated ground speed. So I would want to write down that number. Because at this point, even though my true airspeed is 116, we actually have a tailwind coming off the right-hand side. So where my mouse is right now over the grommet, you can assume that is the airplane, your airplane. And if you visualize it, the red dot is where the wind is coming from. Okay, so we want to write down 120. The next step is that you guys will see that this line represents 5 degrees, this one represents 10 degrees, and then we have 15 degrees. So what we want to do is we want to figure out how many units to the right or to the left of the center line, which is basically where all these values are. Okay, how many units to the right or to the left is my pencil dot, or in this case, my red dot. Okay, so I know I've got 10, 11, almost 12 here. So I would actually write down that value as well. Okay, everyone following along with that? So the two numbers that I have written down so far is my ground speed of 120, which is found underneath the grommet. And then where the red dot is, that's going to give you your wind correction angle. And we need to know, is it to the right of the center line or is it to the left of the center line? Okay. In this case, it's to the right of the center line. And I have written down 12. Okay. So you can do 12.5 if you want, but 12 is going to be easier to follow. Questions about that so far? All right, let's look at the second line as well. So the second line, we would do the exact same thing, basically just reversing everything that we just did. So if we looked at this, you could basically start over. So you would put your grommet over 100 here. And then what I'll do is I'll plug in the winds aloft. If your winds aloft changed, then you would have to do this every single time. Basically, if there's no changes in the winds aloft, then you could, you could actually just spin it to your new course. We'll do it one more time. So my grommet's over 100. I'm going to put 060 in at the top because that is my wind direction. I'm going to mark 26 up from 100, which is 126, which is where my red dot is there. So that's basically step 1 and 2. Step 3 is I need to figure out what is my true course for the third leg. And my third leg is going to be from Santa Maria to San Luis Obispo. So for this, it's 336. So 336. I'm going to go ahead and spin this until I put 336 at the top there. So there's 335, there's 336, okay? The final step that I need to do is I need to put that red dot, which is still on the right-hand side over there, over 116, which happens to be my true airspeed. So there's 110, there's 115, and there's about 116. So I'll zoom in again. You can see my red dot is right over 116. And I'm going to write down 2 other values here. Underneath the grommet in the center, that is my ground speed. So I have an estimated ground speed of approximately 110 knots, it looks like. And the next question I have is how many units to the right of the center line is this dot? Okay, we can see that we've got 5, we've got 10, and we've got 11, 12, almost 13 units to the right is my red dot, okay? So I want to notate that as well, okay? So what we're doing, if I go back to our presentation here, is we're going to have a couple pieces of information, and what we're trying to figure out is 2 different things, okay? So number 1 is what is the wind correction angle, if any? And then number 2, what is the ground speed? So by using each one of, we would have to do this line by line. By basically calculating each one of these, we would come up with something that looks just like this, except I noticed one error because it should all be 110 right here. So what you would do is with the wind correction angle, the reason why I'm asking to you how many units to the right or to the left it is, then we either add it or subtract it. And it's always, you can find this information on your E6B and you can also find it on the flight plan. So in this example, once we actually get our wind correction angle, most of them are all to the right. So what it was telling us is that because it's to the right, we add the value. If it's to the left of center, we subtract the value. And very simply, all you're going to do is take this number. We've got our true course, which is what we figured out using our aviation plotter. We have our wind correction angle of plus 19, and then just simple arithmetic here. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to take 314 plus 19, and that gives us 333. Okay. And that means that computes our true heading. Same thing with the second line, 314 plus 12, and we get 326. Now, technically, the second one that we did, or basically the first one that we did, was roughly around 12.5. The problem is that these are degrees, right? We're trying to come up with a compass heading at the end of the day. It's very difficult to fly a 12.5 degree or even a half a degree, let alone getting very close to a specific degree when you're flying. That's the reason why I was saying just keep it simple. I usually don't, I'll just round up or down to the nearest whole number. So 12.5, I'm just saying is 12. That's how I'm coming up with that value. And then you're basically going to continue with those wind correction angles, right? We have 336 plus 13, and that gives me 349. And all you're going to do is take your true course, your wind correction angle, either add it or subtract it, and then you're going to come up with your true heading. The next step that we have is figuring out our variation. Now, our variation is dependent upon where your flight is. And the reason why we calculate this is remember that magnetic north is different than true north. Your true course is based upon, it's not compensating for magnetic north quite yet, okay? So what we're going to do is we're actually going to look for these things called isogonic lines somewhere along your chart. And depending on where you are in the country and wherever your flight is, you'll see that some will be westerly variations, pretty much all along the East Coast. And then the majority of the country is going to have an easterly variation. Along the chart up by Paso Robles here, you're going to see that we found one that kind of slices through the airspace, and it's 13 degrees east. The easiest way to remember this is east is least and west is best. So if you have an easterly variation, you're going to subtract the value. If you have a westerly variation, you're going to add the value. Okay? East is least and west is best. So what we do from this point is we're going to basically apply this value to our entire flight. Now, if you're maybe doing a flight, across the country, you may have several different isogonic lines that you want to basically adjust for, meaning that if I'm flying up to San Francisco, we are at 13 degrees east here. If I go another 100 miles, I'll be somewhere around 14 degrees east. And if I make it up to San Francisco, it'll be 15 degrees east. Okay. So depending on how long your flight is, you may have to adjust as you basically go from area to area. And this is basically compensating due to that variation. Now, what we're actually doing in this component is because this is such a short flight, there's only one variation. It's 13 degrees east. So with 13 degrees east, because east is least, I subtract the value. If you forget that, there's a minus E for east and a plus W for west. So now that I have that, I'm basically just putting in negative 13 in all of these right here. And then once again, it's simple arithmetic. I'm basically going to take 333 in the first one. I'm going to subtract 13 from that value. Okay. And then that gives me my magnetic heading. So in this case, it is 320. Then I'll continue down 326 less 13 again. Right? It's going to give me 313. 349 less 13 is going to give me 336. 12 minus 13 is going to give me 359 degrees, right? Because once we get to 0, it starts over again. And basically, it's the same thing down here. So now that we have that done, the next step is what is our deviation? Do we need to account for deviation in this other area here? So let's go ahead and remind you what deviation is. So remember that every airplane has a deviation card installed in it. And with the deviation card, there's usually going to be some type of interference, usually due to radios, communication equipment, any type of interference inside of that aircraft will be basically applied to your deviation card. Okay. So in the example that I have here, going way back a couple weeks here, we have, if we wanted to truly fly north, we would actually have to subtract 1 from the value that we're trying to fly. Okay. So instead of flying 360 or 0, we'd have to fly 359. If I wanted to fly east, instead of flying 090, I would have to subtract 1 and fly 089. This is actually a pretty good compass. Every airplane has different values, and just for simplicity's sake, for the purpose of this class, we are going to assume that we actually have a perfect compass, meaning that there is no deviation in it. A lot of flight schools will do this just because every time we do it, it takes forever to actually look at the values and compensate for them. So in our case, I'm going to assume we've got a perfect airplane, perfect with no deviation, and I'm going to run 0 across the board. And then very simply, it's just you're going to figure out the difference between those values. And then in this case, your final number here, 320, 313, 336, 359, etc. This is your compass heading. That's what you would actually fly using the compass, okay? So you should have a document that looks something very similar to this at this point. Hopefully everybody is following along. Yep, if yours is saying, okay, great question. This is an older chart from last summer. If you are looking at a current chart, I guess you guys are saying that it's 12.5 or 12.3. Look at that together real quick. Find the isogonic line here. All right, so let's look at the current one because this one's from just a couple months ago. So here's your isogonic line that's kind of cutting through. You can see that it's kind of extended, and all I got to do is figure out where the heck it is. So right here, it says 12 degrees, 30 minutes east. So what you can do is, it's really up to you. If you want to put 12.5, you can. Remember, very difficult to fly half a degree. I'd probably just round up or down for simplicity's sake, unless there's a reason to do, to have it another way. Okay. But I guess, yeah, it does change every single year, depending on how much it changes. All right. So now that we are, everybody hang in there, 20 more minutes, I promise. Now that we are looking a little bit better with something that is almost complete, but not quite, the last step that we do is we're going to basically, instead of using that wind side, instead of basically using the, I always call it the wind side, we're going to flip it over and use the flight computer side. And we need to calculate our estimated time en route. And then we also need to calculate our fuel burn. Okay. So you always need to do estimated time en route before you do fuel. You can't do it vice versa. So like I said, everything should be done from left to right to the best of your ability. So the next step that we're going to look at here, go back to this, is you guys should flip over your E6Bs. And let me go ahead and bring the E6B up one more time. When we are calculating the estimated time en route, there's actually a couple different things that we look at. Number one, on this side of your flight computer, you're going to notice in the very lower portion, depending on how it's flipped around, you will usually see the actual equations and basically how to set up the information for both. In this case, this is basically your first one, where it says set miles per hour or knots over your triangle, and that's going to equal the distance on the outer ring and then the time on the inner ring. So there's two different rings that we talk about. The outer ring is just that, it's the outside ring, and then the inner ring is the one that's actually movable. It's the card that's movable, and that's step number one. Step number two is then we're going to calculate our fuel burn, and that's over here. We're going to do that in a minute, but I would highly recommend, so you get in the, kind of in the habit, do all of your calculations. So instead of trying to do it line by line and switching everything up, basically do all of your crosswind calculations, do all of your variation calculations, do all of your ETE, and then do all of your fuel. So that way you guys will get multiple chances to practice the exact same thing rather than trying to go from left to right, instead of doing it line by line. Okay. So with this is your triangle. They all kind of look slightly different, but they're all set up the same. They should all give us the same answer. And what we need to do is we need to basically figure out what is our ground speed, right? And our ground speed in this is what we computed in the last step. And that's the reason why we have to basically do this, like I said, step by step. For example, we don't need to do the first line because the first line, the book did, basically the book did for us, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the second line and the third line and so forth, okay? So the next one that we have is we've got 120 knots and we are going a distance of 11.3 nautical miles. So the question is how long is it going to take us to get there? So using your E6B, the flight computer side, I'm going to go ahead and go to the other one here. Basically, you can go to the slide rule side, what they're calling it. Here is the information that I said at the bottom. So the first one is always your estimated time en route, where it says set miles per hour or knots over the triangle. The distance is on the outer, and then we read the time on the inner. So basically, it's just like an algebra problem, right? We're trying to solve for x here. So the things that I need in this point is I told you we're going 120 knots. Now you're going to notice that 120 does not exist on this E6B. What we have to do is you can basically use any of these numbers. So for example, I am going to put 12 right here, 12 over the triangle. And the 12 could represent 1.2, could represent 1.2 knots. It could represent 12 knots, or it could represent 120 knots or 1200 knots. So very simply, this is a very adjustable device depending on how you want to move the decimal point. So 1.2 is going to equal 120 knots in our example. Okay, so that's basically step number 1. Now, the next step that it said was that we basically are going to go ahead and read the distance on the outer. So the outer portion is the portion that does not spin. So all the numbers that are fixed is considered the outer. Everything that spins is going to be considered the inner. So step number 1 is figure out what my ground speed is. And remember, don't do this off your true airspeed. Do it off of your ground speed. If you have a tailwind, you're going to be going much faster than your true airspeed. If you have a headwind, you're probably going to be going slower. So now that I have this set up, I've got my speed at the top, 120 or 12, and then it's right above my triangle. The next step is to go back to and figure out how far am I going. In this case, it's 11.3 nautical miles. The distance is on the outer one. So if you look here, you have 11 right at the top, and then I've got 11.1, 11.2, 11.3. So I read the distance on the outer, and then I look and try to match it up to the inner. And what you're going to see here is it is above 55. It's actually 56, 56.5. Okay. But it can't take 56.5 minutes to go 11 miles, right? So remember, this is where we have to kind of use some common sense. In this case, this 55 is representing 5.5 minutes. Okay. This is 5.6 minutes. Okay. So in this case, it's going to be roughly about a little over 5.6 minutes in order to travel 11.3 nautical miles, going with basically having a ground speed of 120. Okay, the next one that we'll do is the same thing, but we're going to adjust the ground speed. In this case, for the third line, our ground speed should read 110. I think actually this one's 100. We're going to do 100. So very simply, I'm going to figure out where 100 is, and my 10 could be 10 knots. In this case, it's 100 knots. Then I'm going to put that over my triangle. My distance is red on the outside, and then my time is red on the inside. So the distance for the third leg is 22.2 nautical miles. Okay, so I kind of have to move this thing over. Not going to spin it. And here in the far corner, here is 22. So I'm going to go, let's see, 22.2 is actually right about here. And what that's telling me is here's 13 minutes, 13 and a half minutes, 13.1, 13.2, 13.3-ish minutes. So it should take us about 13.3 minutes to travel 22.2 nautical miles, going roughly 100 knots. Okay, that's one. Once we have all of that basically computed, then we're basically going to start adding in the information as we do it step by step. So let me go back here. And this is your formula, right? So remember, you always have this on your E6B. You're going to put the knots over the triangle. Then you're going to have the distance on the outer and the time on the inner, right? The known values are the knots, and the known value is the distance, and we're trying to solve for time. At that point, we'll go ahead and basically populate the rest of the sheet here with those values that we have. And then the next and final step that we're going to have is going to be calculating your fuel burn, which is actually going to be the second step down here. So in order to calculate your fuel burn, instead of putting your speed over the triangle, what you're going to do is you need to figure out what was your fuel burn, right? So during the performance section, we calculated a fuel burn of 8.1 gallons per hour. And this is something that we could just set once, and then we can actually look at it leg by leg. Then on this one, instead of starting with the outer and reading the inner, we actually do the opposite, right? Because we have the time now, because we did the last step, and we're trying to figure out how many gallons are we going to use in order, during this time period. Okay, we flip it a little bit. So very simply, the first step is to put 8.1 underneath the triangle. So I'm going to put, you'll see the 80, which is going to represent, remember, we can move the decimal as many times as we want. So in this case, instead of 80 gallons an hour, it's 8.0. So I'm going to move that slightly to the right, and I've got my triangle under 81, which is representing 8.1 gallons. The next step is to look at each one of the times that we had earlier. So the very, very first time that I have, I'm going to go to the second line here. And with the second line, the time that I had was approximately, pull it out here. The time that I had was 5.8 minutes. So in 5.8 minutes, how much fuel are we actually going to burn? Once again, go and try to figure out where 5.8 is, or in our case, 58. So I see 60. And remember that we read the time on the inner, and then we basically figure out the fuel on the outer. So in this case, let's see, here is 5.5, 5.6, 5.7, 5.8. Okay, so this is 5.8. I'm going to come up. You're going to notice it's basically slightly to the left of 80, meaning that's 79, 70. Okay, that if I'm flying for, right? In this case, it can't be 7.6, a little over 8 gallons an hour. So the only reasonable thing to expect is it's going to basically be roughly about 0.76 gallons. Third one, we assume that we're going to basically be traveling for 13 and a half minutes. Once again, with this, because the fuel burn does not change, you do not need to actually spin it. All we need to do is figure out where 13 and a half minutes is on the inner scale. And it's actually on the opposite side here. Here's 13, and then here's 13.5. And then what we're going to do is we're going to read on the outside scale. So here's 18, and we're right between 18 and 19. Okay. So in this case, this is not 18 gallons. This is definitely not, this is 1.8 gallons. Okay. Because we're going 13 minutes, because roughly we're using or consuming 8.1 gallons per hour. Okay. So all of the E6Bs always have everything printed on them that you need. Just keep that in mind. They're all listed on the bottom of all these documents. And most of the flight plans that they're giving you will have this information printed as well. Once you have all of your fuel burn calculated, then you'll basically compute it as follows. And then the main thing is you want to then apply the totals in your distance, your time, and also your fuel burn. Okay. And with the fuel burn, remember that you do also need to account for your legal minimums. So 30 minutes during the day and 45 minutes at night. So I'm basically basing that off of 8.1 gallons, right? So about half of 8.1 is another 4 gallons. And if I'm flying at night, I need another 6 gallons. Now, these are the legal minimums. If you have something, if you have higher personal minimums, then go ahead and add that in there as well. Okay. So at this point, that basically takes you through a completed flight plan without going too late. The things that I can recommend to you is these are things that are just going to take practice. And in terms of using the E6B, I recommend you check out that video. I'll see if Travis can post it underneath this lesson as well, just for simplicity's sake. There is a worksheet that goes with it. So basically what we do is I go through about 15 of these calculations. I do 5 of your wind correction angles, 5 of your ETE, and 5 of your fuel burn, and basically treat it like a poll. You guys all get 60 seconds to figure out, and we talk about it and show you guys how to do it step by step. Usually if you do 4 or 5 of these, you'll understand the calculation side a lot better. Okay. And then the other important thing is when it comes to test questions, if you understand the correct order of everything, then you should be able to calculate missing values. Okay, so what I mean by that is they may not tell you your variation, but they may give you all the other numbers. So you should know that if the difference between your true heading and your magnetic heading is your variation, right? We have all the calculations at the top, and then it's also located on your E6B. If you guys look at your very, very top of your E6B, depending on how or whichever one you guys have on that device, every calculation you'll need is on there. I'll swing this one back over. So this is your wind side, right? So you have your true course, which is your either subtract for east or add for west, and the variation is going to equal your magnetic course. Magnetic course is the difference of your wind correction, which is equal to your magnetic heading. Magnetic heading is plus or minus your deviation, which is equal to your compass heading, the exact same order that we had in the previous one. On your flight computer side, everything that you need to know is going to be these 2 equations here. We always start with the top equation, and then we do the bottom equation. So the top one is going to be your estimated time en route for a certain leg. Then the bottom one is going to be your fuel burn for that leg, depending on how much time is elapsed. Okay. Yep. So all right, everybody. So thanks again for sticking it out. I understand that, and I definitely been in your shoes. I know how challenging flight planning can be. There is a lot of information and a lot of steps that we went through, but I would encourage you, as I stated at the very beginning of class, to write down those steps and kind of, feel free to figure out whatever airplane you end up flying, figure out what is in that pilot operating handbook or that AFM. And that's where we gather, that's where we actually obtain the majority of this information as a starting point. So what I would encourage you to do is plan your own fictional flight, just like what we did, and pull the weather on 1-800-WX-BRIEF, now that you have an account, hopefully, and, try this. And the more practice that you do, if you can do 4, 5, or 6 of these, even though it takes a lot of time, that 4 hours that we took is going to slowly start to shrink down into maybe about 30 or 40 minutes. You can already see that by the time we had our fuel numbers and our calculations, the weather that we pulled was already kind of obsolete at that point, and it would have already been too late. In addition to that, remember that with the E6B, you're not going to be an expert overnight, and this is very much kind of a use it or lose it type device. I would recommend taking a look at the video that we have beneath the live stream. Remember that the E6B problems, there's basically a set of 15 problems. You can work through them in real time as I do. So basically I give you a problem. I give you about 60 to 90 seconds to calculate it, depending on whichever problem we're working on, whatever side of the E6B. And then we review it in real time and talk about how we came up with that calculation. You can actually see how I spin the device and where does my pencil dot go and everything else. And that's helped out a lot of students as well. So keep that in mind. It's not, it's going to take a while to kind of get to that perfection, but I do appreciate everybody hanging out and sticking with it. I do know it's a long lesson. A lot of people's brains are going to explode here. But I promise you, it does get easier. Moving forward for our very, very last class, just as a reminder, it does get a little bit easier on the last class. We're going to talk a little bit about admin stuff for our final class. Just at the very beginning, first 20 or 30 minutes, we'll talk about closing out the course, getting your materials in terms of your testing endorsement, taking the final exam, and everything else and everything that's important there. But we still also have a lot of safety related things. We're going to talk about aeromedical factors. We're going to talk about hazardous attitudes, crew resource management, single pilot resource management, illusions, and a few others as well. So still plenty of information that is testable. And that's going to be the game plan for our final day of class. As always, huge shout out to the moderators. Thank you again for all of your help. If you still have questions, our moderators are going to stick around and answer those for you. If there was something that completely went over your head and or maybe after class you thought about it and you have a question on it, please use Ask a CFI. We do take a look at those 2 to 3 times per day and get back to you. Or you can even post it in the Facebook group, whatever is easier for you there. So with that, I am going to go ahead and sign off, save my voice, and I hope everyone, like I said, had a great time today. Try to have some fun with this stuff, and I'll see everybody in about a day and a half, 2 days. Take care, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you later.